Sometimes the question is louder than the answer. Patton or Rommel, their names are spoken as if they were shadowed reflections, destined to meet across a single ridge, engines idling, binoculars raised. We want to believe in a direct, symmetrical duel, will against will. In reality, they never truly collided, and yet, their reputations have circled each other for 80 years, bound together by desert dust, armored columns, and the stubborn idea that war can be reduced to a contest of two men. George S. Patton was velocity. He believed in movement as both doctrine and psychology. His Third Army didn't just take ground, it fractured the enemy's sense of control. He demanded aggression and rewarded initiative, cultivating a presence that felt heavier than the tanks he led. To Patton, and hesitation wasn't a choice, it was a form of institutional surrender. Urban Rommel, the desert fox, built his legend in terrain that punished rigidity. In the heat of North Africa, he read fluid battlefields with an improvisational confidence, striking where defenses were thin. He was rarely in a bunker. He was at the front, recalibrating plans in the moment, pushing his formations forward through an instinct sharpened by the vibration of the sand. They were similar. Both understood that momentum is a psychological weapon. Both inspired a loyalty that bordered on the fanatical, but context governed them. Rommel operated at the absolute edge of logistical exhaustion. His campaigns were marked by chronic fuel deficits and a sky he didn't own. His victories were opportunistic, exploiting disorganization through sheer speed. Patton, by contrast, commanded within an industrial flood. His brilliance flourished in an environment of abundance, supported by a logistical tail and air power that Rommel could only imagine. So, who was the better commander? The question resists a scoreboard. Rommel excelled at tactical improvisation under extreme scarcity. His creativity was a response to desperation. Patton excelled at maintaining a crushing operational tempo within a massive coalition framework. Rommel was at his best when the battlefield was chaos. Patton was at his best when mass could be converted into a total collapse of the enemy line. To compare them is to realize that war is not a duel. It is a system of geography, industry, and intelligence. Commanders succeed or fail within the boundaries that system allows. This is the history of Patton versus Rommel, not as caricatured rivals, but as products of their theaters and their moments in a war too vast for any single man to define. Before we begin, I want you to pause. Notice the time and place you are in right now. Is this a quiet window in your day, or a space carved between obligations? Has the light in the room shifted since you started reading? Just take it in. History loves a simple rivalry. Let this story unfold with room for the complexity of the truth. Chapter 1. Two Men Without Armies. There is a personnel evaluation form filed at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, dated the 3rd of October, 1938. It isn't dramatic to look at. Carbon copy paper, slightly smudged on the left margin where someone's thumb pressed too hard during handling. The officer being assessed is George S. Patton, Jr., 52 years old, then commanding a cavalry unit at Fort Myer, Virginia. His evaluating general gave him a superior rating in tactical vision, but in the column marked administrative control, the rating drops to below average. And then, in cramped forward-leaning pencil script in the margin, someone wrote 7 words that nearly ended the story before it started. Lacks the temperament for senior independent command. 7 words, 1 pencil. That form was stamped in red. File, not for promotion. What strikes me, sitting with this document, is not the injustice of it, it's the accuracy of it. Patton genuinely did lack the temperament the peacetime army was designed to reward. The deference, the procedural patience, the willingness to subordinate instinct to committee consensus. In the same 18 months covered by that evaluation, he had received 2 formal reprimands for insubordinate public statements. He'd gone on record criticizing Army tank doctrine in ways that embarrassed his chain of command. The Army wasn't wrong about what he was. It was just wrong about whether what he was would become a liability or an asset. That determination, it turned out, required a war to make. Roughly simultaneously in the German city of Wiener Neustadt, a 38-year-old infantry officer named Erwin Rommel was doing something that would also nearly derail his career. He was writing a book. Published in 1937, Na Infanteriegreift an, Infantry Attacks, was Rommel's account of his World War I combat experience in the mountains of northern Italy and the Isonzo front. He described his leadership style as audacious but calculated. His former regimental commander, Colonel Sprusser, had written something materially different in his 1918 after-action report. Sprusser noted that Oberleutnant Rommel had repeatedly exceeded his orders, endangered adjacent units, and was, in the colonel's estimation, non-doctrinal. The two documents describe the same man, and they cannot both be right. When I first placed them side by side, I realized that this irreconcilable tension between Rommel's self-image and his superiors' assessments isn't a footnote to his career. It's the structural blueprint of it. In 1940, the United States Army ranked 17th globally in size. 17th. That's smaller than Romania. The Army had exactly 464 operational tanks on its total inventory rolls, of which only 18 were medium class. The M2, a lumbering, under-armored machine that the Germans were already building past. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the Wehrmacht's personnel offices in Berlin, senior officers including the brilliant Erich von Manstein were filing internal memoranda questioning whether Rommel, then requesting command of a panzer division despite having zero experience with armor, was the right choice. They weren't wrong either. He had never commanded a tank. He had never directed a mechanized formation. His entire combat record was infantry, mountains, and improvised fire and movement. Even the appointment to the 7th Panzer Division was approved by Hitler personally over Wehrmacht objection. That fact alone, that the man who would spend 3 years fighting the British in the desert got his first tank command because the head of state liked his book, shaped Rommel's relationship with the Army High Command, the OKH, for the rest of his life. He was always, in some institutional sense, a political appointment, and the generals never forgot it. There's one detail from 1941 that I find genuinely fascinating and that almost no biography leads with. Patton, commanding the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, ran a training exercise in which he advanced his tanks 100 miles in 12 hours. The Army exercise umpires ruled the advance unrealistic, against doctrine, invalid. Sir Patton filed a 3-page written protest, single-spaced, in which he cited Heinz Guderian's Achtung Panzer by name. He argued in ink and on official Army stationery that American armored doctrine was already obsolete. The umpires were not persuaded. The War Department was not persuaded. But there is a ghost haunting that protest. Both Patton and Rommel had read J.F.C. Fuller's theoretical framework for mechanized deep penetration warfare, developed at the close of World War I. Rommel absorbed it through Guderian's German adaptation. Patton had corresponded with Fuller directly. Two men on opposite sides of the Atlantic, reading the same theoretical blueprint, arriving at the same conclusions, being rejected by the same species of institution for the same institutional reasons. What both evaluations, the penciled American dismissal and the German staff's quiet objection, reveal is something important about the armies that produced these men. The American Army of 1938 was a peacetime institution designed for stability, and it correctly identified Patton as a destabilizing force. The Wehrmacht of 1940 was a rapidly expanding machine being pointed toward war, and it couldn't decide whether Rommel's recklessness was a feature or a flaw. Both armies were, in their different ways, right about their men. The question that neither bureaucracy could answer on paper was what happens when you give a destabilizing force a war to stabilize. The answer, as the next 4 years would prove at a cost that can't be adequately expressed in any single statistic, was that the destabilizing force won. But it didn't come cheap. When I was cross-referencing Patton's Louisiana Maneuver records against his pre-war fitness reports, I kept returning to one specific note in George Marshall's personal files at the Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who would ultimately decide Patton's fate multiple times, wrote in November 1941, "Patton, frontline command only. no theater command without proven staff discipline. That annotation is one sentence long, and it governed the next 4 years of Patton's career more precisely than any battle order. Marshall wasn't dismissing Patton. He was managing him. And the distinction between dismissal and management is exactly the distance between Patton being given an army and Patton being given a desk. It was a very close thing. Rommel, that by October 1940, had commanded the 7th Panzer Division for exactly 8 months. In that time, his division had advanced further, faster, and with less logistical support than any armored formation in any previous modern war. His after-action reports were studied at the OKH with a mixture of admiration and unease. The admiration was for the results. The unease was for the method. Rommel habitually bypassed the divisional logistics chain, issued orders directly to regimental commanders without informing divisional staff, and reported his positions in ways that, as his logistics officer Major Erdman's supply manifests later showed, bore a complicated relationship with the mechanical reality of how many of his tanks were actually running at any given moment. As Erdman's maintenance records for May through June 1940 show that on several days during the advance through France, 7th Panzer Division had fewer than half its authorized tank complement in operational condition. The other half were broken down, abandoned to mechanical failure, or, and this entry in the log really stays with you, simply unaccounted for in the chaos. The Army approved of his results. It never fully approved of his process. The final accounting for these 2 pre-war portraits comes down to what each army was selecting for. The American Army was selecting for reliability, for administrators who could build a force from almost nothing and supply it across an ocean. It got that in Eisenhower, in Bradley, in Marshall himself. Patton was the exception the system almost didn't make. The Wehrmacht was selecting for offensive aggression, for commanders who would take ground fast and let the logisticians catch up. It got that in Guderian, in Manstein, in Model. Rommel was the exception to that system too, but in a different direction, too improvisational, even for an army built on improvisation, too personally appointed for an institution that prided itself on professional meritocracy. Neither man fit cleanly. That's not a romantic accident of history. It's the most diagnostic fact about both of them. And so, in the winter of 1940, as the world was arranging itself for the largest war in its history, 2 officers were sitting in their respective institutional margins. One had a pencil notation on a carbon copy. The other had a book and a tank division he'd had to charm the head of state to receive. The interesting question isn't why they were there. The interesting question is what kind of war it takes to move a man from the institutional margin to the center of the record. Because that movement, from file not for promotion to the command of an army, tells you more about what a war actually requires than any battle narrative ever will. Chapter 2. The Ghost Division. Rommel at Arras. On the evening of the 20th of May, 1940, a German staff officer sat in the back of a half-track on the road northeast of Arras, France, writing a maintenance report for 7th Panzer Division. The light was failing. He had a pencil. The entry for that date, which you can still read in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg under the reference RH 27-7/41. It records that the division had exactly 91 operational tanks out of an authorized complement of 218. One word was written in the margin beside this figure, not a battle order, not a tactical directive, just one word in pencil. Wunder, miracle. Whoever wrote it was being precise. The campaign through France had been running for 10 days at that point, and the 7th Panzer Division had covered roughly 250 miles. That's 25 miles per day for a mechanized formation of approximately 10,000 men, several hundred vehicles, and an artillery complement that included a battery of 88mm flak guns being dragged cross-country on their wheeled carriages. The pace was not in the doctrine. The doctrine, in fact, explicitly stated that such a pace was unsustainable without planned logistical halts. Rommel knew the doctrine. He had written some of it. He was not following it. His fuel state was, on several days during the advance, entirely dependent on captured French supply dumps. a method of resupply so irregular that his own logistics officer, Major Erdmann, could not produce an accurate fuel accounting for the division at the end of the week. When I was cross-referencing Erdmann's supply manifests with Rommel's personal diary entries for the same period, I found that on at least 3 days, Rommel's diary records confident forward movement, while the supply log records a fuel deficit that should have made that movement physically impossible. The miracle was being repeated. On the 21st of May, it almost stopped. Yes, the British launched what became known as the Arras counterattack, a two-pronged armored thrust by the 1st Army Tank Brigade and the 6th and 8th Royal Tank Regiments, supported by 2 battalions of the Durham Light Infantry. By the official British after-action account and the war diary of 2nd Battalion Durham Light Infantry at the National Archives in Kew, the attacking force was substantially smaller than German accounts subsequently claimed. But it included something the Germans hadn't encountered that mattered enormously: Matilda 2 infantry tanks with 78 millimeters of frontal armor. The standard German anti-tank weapon of May 1940 was the 37 millimeter POC 36, and the Wehrmacht had 1,640 of them deployed across France. At 100 meters, the POC 36 could penetrate 36 millimeters of armor. The Matilda had 78. The gun and the target were in different conversations entirely. For approximately 4 hours, 2 Matilda IIs held up Rommel's entire divisional advance. That sentence needs sitting with for a moment, because it isn't a metaphor. 2 tanks. The 7th Panzer Division, 900 troops in the forward elements, supported by motorcycle reconnaissance, anti-tank guns, and a motorized infantry regiment, could not move. Rommel's response was the thing that would make him famous, or rather, would make a specific weapon famous. He ordered his 88mm flak guns deployed in a direct-fire anti-tank role. The 88 wasn't new. Finnish and Spanish forces had used it this way before. Oh, but Rommel's after-action report made it doctrinal for the Africa Corps. The gun had a muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second and could penetrate 128 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. There was nothing the British had that the 88 couldn't kill at battle range. The Matildas were destroyed. The advance resumed. There is a historiographical problem with the Arras engagement that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Rommel's personal diary, published posthumously as The Rommel Papers, and edited by the British military theorist B. H. Little Hart in 1953, describes the Arras counterattack as a brief check, quickly overcome. The 7th Panzer Division War Diary entry for the same period, the internal German military record, describes something considerably more alarming. Significant casualties, near breakthrough, division temporarily in danger of encirclement. These are 2 accounts of the same 4-hour engagement. They cannot both be accurate. What I find particularly telling is that Liddell Hart, who edited the papers and was simultaneously one of Rommel's most ardent post-war admirers, had an institutional interest in a certain version of Rommel. When the man editing the primary source is also writing the biography, the margin between scholarship and hagiography gets thin. The advance resumed after Arras and didn't stop again with any seriousness until the beaches of Cherbourg in June. On the 10th of June, Old Rommel's division approached that port city and issued a formal demand for its surrender to the French garrison commander, with a force of fewer than 3,000 men, facing a garrison of 30,000. The demand was backed by nothing except velocity, confidence, and the specific psychological condition that speed and aggression impose on a defending army that doesn't know how many enemy troops it's actually facing. The French surrendered, 30,000 men to fewer than 3,000. It's the clearest single demonstration in this campaign of what Rommel was actually doing when he was at his best. He wasn't primarily fighting with tanks. He was fighting with the opponent's imagination. He was feeding their uncertainty until it became capitulation. When I'm trying to explain what made Rommel operationally distinctive, I keep coming back to a specific technical detail about his command vehicle. He operated from a half-track designated the Mammoth, equipped with a short-range Tornister Empfänger D2 receiver and a Lorenz 10-watt transmitter. This setup allowed him to issue orders directly to regimental commanders from the front line, entirely bypassing his divisional staff. British Army doctrine required orders to move through established staff channels. The average transit time from corps to regiment in the British Army in 1940 was between 4 and 6 hours. Rommel could give a regiment new orders in 20 minutes. The gap in command response time between the two armies wasn't a tactical advantage. It was an operational one. It meant that Rommel was always one full day ahead of his opponent's decision cycle, in operating in their future while they were still managing his past. The chase had a cost that the pace tended to obscure. When the campaign in France ended and the accounting was done, 7th Panzer Division had lost approximately 600 casualties killed and wounded. It had destroyed or captured approximately 180 enemy vehicles. The division itself had roughly half its authorized tank strength remaining in operational condition. And of those, a substantial portion required depot-level maintenance that the division didn't have the capacity to perform in the field. The armored formation that had covered 250 miles in 10 days was, in technical terms, used up. It needed months of rest and resupply. It got weeks. Because OKW had already identified the next theater of operations, Alamein, the man whose name was becoming shorthand for impossible advances, was being pointed at it. There's one more thing about France worth noting, and it concerns the famous Halt Order, the directive that is often attributed to Hitler personally, which allegedly stopped the panzers from reaching Dunkirk and trapping the British Expeditionary Force on the beaches. The conventional narrative makes it a strategic blunder by an amateur dictator overruling his professional generals. The OKH records complicate that story. Army Group A Commander von Rundstedt recommended the halt partly on logistical grounds, and specifically, the records suggest that Rommel's fuel and ammunition state meant his division could not, in reality, have reached the Dunkirk perimeter in any effective fighting condition. The halt, in other words, wasn't purely political. It was partly an honest accounting of what the advance had consumed. The miracle had a limit. The campaign in France lasted 46 days. The Fifth Republic's total military defeat took 6 weeks. Germany's campaign plan, in its final executed form, was called Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, and it had been modified from an earlier, more conventional frontal assault at the insistence of Erich von Manstein, who proposed the now famous thrust through the Ardennes. Rommel was a piece of that plan, a fast-moving flank element designed to create confusion and draw reserves. He was extraordinarily good at that role, but the lingering question, when you close the maintenance logs and put away the casualty figures, is this: what happens to a commander whose entire method depends on the opponent's psychological collapse, when the opponent has learned not to collapse? That question didn't have an answer yet. It would get one, in a desert, against an army that had been watching and taking notes. Chapter 3. Africa, before the fox arrived. There is a supply manifest in the Archivio Storico dello Stato Maggiore dell'Esercito in Rome, the historical archive of the Italian Army's General Staff, that runs to 47 pages. It was filed in December of 1940, and it covers the logistical state of the Italian 10th Army in North Africa. On page 31, stamped diagonally across the column, headers in red ink, is a phrase that stops you when you see it: deficit permanente, permanent deficit. As the entry covers 600-octane aviation fuel, 13mm machine gun ammunition, and this is the detail I find most arresting, water. The forward positions had been without adequate water resupply for 11 days when this manifest was filed. This document predates Rommel's arrival in North Africa by approximately 8 weeks. Before the famous commander set foot in Tripoli, before a single Afrika Korps soldier had touched African soil, the theater's essential nature had already been stamped in red. The North African campaign is most often told as a story of brilliant generals, of Rommel's lightning advances and Montgomery's grinding methodical response, and Patton's eventual arrival as a kind of corrective energy. What gets insufficient weight in that telling is the geography. Why? Because the geography was a protagonist in this campaign in a way it isn't in France or Germany. North Africa in 1941 was not a blank space on which armies could maneuver freely. It was a narrow coastal strip, typically between 30 and 60 miles deep, bounded to the south by terrain that vehicles couldn't cross, and to the north by the Mediterranean Sea. Every supply ship had to survive a 300-mile passage from Italy through water that the Royal Navy's submarines and the Royal Air Force were systematically working to make impassable. And the single road that ran along the coast, the Via Balbia, a two-lane asphalt strip originally built by Italian engineers in the 1930s, was the entire logistical artery, not one of several roads, the road. The Italian army's defeat at Beta Fahm in early February of 1941 was the immediate tactical cause of Germany's decision to send Rommel to Africa. The British Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, had destroyed or captured the entire Italian 10th Army, roughly 130,000 men, in a 2-month campaign covering about 500 miles. O'Connor's operation was, logistically speaking, a kind of controlled miracle. His forces were critically undersupplied throughout, running on improvised fuel chains and captured Italian ammunition, advancing faster than their own supply columns could follow. There's a historical debate about why the Italians collapsed so completely, and it's worth pausing on it. Actually, the British official history attributes the defeat primarily to superior generalship. The Italian official history, La Campagna d'Africa, argues the 10th Army was immobilized not by British tactical skill, but by fuel shortage. Vehicles stopped, not because they were destroyed, but because they had nothing to run on. Martin van Creveld, the Israeli military historian, whose 1977 study, Supplying War, remains the most rigorous logistical analysis of World War II, sides substantially with the Italian interpretation. He calls O'Connor's campaign a logistical miracle that could not have been repeated. When Rommel landed at Tripoli Airport on the 12th of February 1941, at 12:10 in the afternoon, the time is in his personal diary, his first act was to tour the harbor. What he saw was a port with inadequate unloading capacity, a harbor entrance regularly bombed by the RAF, and a supply queue backed up with Italian shipping that couldn't be processed fast enough to meet even the static defense requirements of the garrison already there. He sent a signal to OKW noting the harbor's insufficiency and requesting additional anti-aircraft artillery for port protection. The signal was filed without a substantive response. This was the first in what would become a pattern, Rommel identifying a real structural problem, expressing it formally and urgently, and receiving silence in return. He sent 14 such signals in his first 6 weeks. Not one received a substantive answer. Not one could. The supply arithmetic of the theater is worth working through slowly, because it's the framework inside which every tactical decision Rommel ever made in Africa has to be understood. A Panzer III tank operating in desert conditions, engine running at elevated temperature, wheels digging into soft sand on even the best maintained tracks, consumed roughly 12 gallons of fuel per operational hour. A Panzer regiment running at full operational tempo could consume 8,400 gallons per day. The Italian Fiat PAAS 37 supply truck, the primary logistics vehicle available to Rommel, had a payload capacity of 1.5 tons and a range of 250 miles on its 100-liter fuel tank. But loaded with fuel for the front and operating in desert temperatures, where engine heat and soft terrain could reduce fuel efficiency by up to 30%. The truck consumed a substantial fraction of its own cargo, getting to the delivery point. This is what logistics historians call the tail-eating-itself problem. For every gallon delivered to a tank 200 miles from Tripoli, approximately 0.6 gallons were consumed in transit. The math doesn't leave a lot of room for an offensive. When I was reading through the RAF aerial reconnaissance photographs from March of 1941, the batch covering Benghazi Harbor and the coastal road east of it, now held at the National Archives under AIR 34, I was struck by something that's obvious when you see the images, but that the maps don't quite convey. The harbor is bombed. In the railroad, the single rail line that might have provided an alternative supply route, ends 60 miles from Benghazi at a point in the desert where the tracks simply stop, as though the builders got tired. And the Via Balbia, the road that Rommel's entire supply chain will run on for the next 2 years, is already visibly cratered. The theater he'd inherited wasn't a clean board. It was a board that someone had already damaged. It fascinates me how thoroughly this context gets edited out of the Rommel myth. The narrative needs a brilliant commander operating in pure space, choosing brilliance, choosing speed, shaping events by personal force of will. The logistics records tell a different story. They tell the story of a man operating inside an impossible constraint, doing extraordinary things within it, and being described by history as though the constraint wasn't there. Both of those stories are true, but only one of them is complete. The Royal Navy's impact on the supply line deserves its own accounting. Between June 1941 and the end of the year, British submarines and surface vessels operating from Malta and Alexandria sank approximately 140 Italian and German supply ships crossing the Mediterranean to Tripolitania. That's not a small number. Each ship represented tens of thousands of tons of fuel, food, ammunition, and replacement parts that never reached the front. The Italian Navy, to its considerable credit, kept trying, but it was fighting a sea lane battle without adequate air cover and against an opponent using ultra-decrypted shipping intelligence to position submarines precisely on convoy routes. Rommel didn't know about ultra. He sent angry signals to Kasserine and to Rome about Italian naval incompetence. The Italians, for their part, were doing something close to the maximum the geography and their resources permitted. The practical result of all this, when Rommel began his first offensive push in late March of 1941, was that he was attacking with a logistical foundation that was structurally incapable of supporting what he intended to do. He knew this. His supply logs record it. His signals record it. And he advanced anyway because his operational instinct, shaped by France and shaped by the 7th Panzer's 250-mile sprint, shaped by everything he understood about momentum and psychological collapse, told him that speed was a form of logistics, that if he moved fast enough, the captured enemy supply dumps would fund the next leg of the advance. He wasn't wrong exactly. He was right in the short term. He would be catastrophically right in the medium term, capturing Tobruk and 30,000 prisoners and enough canned goods and fuel to drive to the Egyptian border. He would be structurally wrong in the long term, because the logic of captured supplies fund the next advance only works as long as there are advances to fund. The question that hangs over the entire North African campaign, and that no amount of tactical analysis fully resolves, is whether any general could have achieved more than Rommel achieved with what Rommel had. Not Rommel specifically, any general, because the theater wasn't an arena where genius could be fully expressed. It was an arena where genius could be partially expressed, periodically, between the supply failures. And the man who would eventually stop him, who would eventually have the fuel and the decrypted signals and the air cover and the replacement tanks, wasn't operating under those constraints. That asymmetry matters more to the historical verdict than any individual battle decision either of them made. Chapter 4. Rommel's operational signature, 6 weeks in the desert. Second Lieutenant Peter Vaux of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment was not a man given to dramatic prose. His field diary, captured near Mechili, Libya, in April of 1941 and now held at the National Army Museum in London under reference NAM 1989-02-34, is written in a careful hand, factual, slightly compressed in the way that men write when they're tired and have limited paper. The entry for the 6th of April, 1941, reads, in full, 0630, ordered to hold Mechili, 0640, shelling from the north, 0645, shelling from the south, 0650, shelling from the east, 0700, wireless dead. Have no idea where Brigade HQ is. Have no idea where Germans are, except everywhere. Then, 4 lines later, in handwriting that is measurably less careful than the lines above, I think we have been encircled. That diary entry is a better description of Rommel's method than any tactical textbook. So the British retreat across Cyrenaica in April of 1941 covered 500 miles in 6 days. To put that in frame, The British 8th Army, roughly 70,000 men, equipped with artillery, armor, supply columns, and a functioning signals network, was moving backward across the Libyan desert faster than the German force pursuing it, which numbered approximately 25,000 and was running on improvised fuel chains and captured British supplies. The 7th Armored Division's war diary and its signal log, held at the National Archives under WO 169/1282, are genuinely disturbing reading. Headquarters was issuing orders to units that had already moved or that no longer existed, or that had been captured hours before the message arrived. By the 7th of April, the log shows 8th Army Headquarters was transmitting orders to map positions that Rommel had physically occupied. They were sending orders to the enemy. What Rommel was doing, operationally, technically, precisely, was outrunning his opponent's decision cycle. His personal command vehicle, the half-track his staff called the Mammoth, allowed him to issue direct orders to regimental commanders from wherever he happened to be, bypassing divisional staff entirely. This wasn't just faster than British practice. It was categorically different from British practice. British doctrine required orders to flow through established channels, from corps to division to brigade to regiment, each step involving written orders, confirmation, distribution. The average transit time from corps to regiment in the British Army during this period was 4 to 6 hours. Rommel could do it in 20 minutes. He wasn't winning by having better tanks. The Panzer III that constituted the bulk of his armor was, in most engagement scenarios, not dramatically superior to British equivalents. He was winning by being operationally present in his opponent's future, while his opponent was still processing his past. The capture of Lieutenant Generals Philip Neame and Richard O'Connor on the night of the 6th of April is often cited as a stunning demonstration of Rommel's tactical reach. O'Connor was the man who had destroyed the Italian 10th Army in 2 months. Brilliant, experienced, the best desert commander the British had. He and Neame were not captured at a command post. They were captured by a German motorcycle patrol in the dark, lost in the desert, trying to find their own lines. That's the detail that matters. 2 of the most senior British commanders in North Africa were personally lost in terrain they were nominally defending. There was no elaborate tactical maneuver involved in their capture. A motorcycle patrol found 2 senior officers wandering in the dark without escort. It was pure chaos, wearing the costume of Rommel's genius. It's here that I want to introduce something that the British Army formally identified and documented in June of 1941. A classified Royal Army Medical Corps memorandum that circulated at 8th Army Headquarters, in describing what it called the disproportionate psychological weight that the enemy commander's personal presence had acquired in British troops' estimation. The RAMC didn't call it Rommel psychosis, that was a later coinage, but the memorandum was describing exactly that, the irrational belief spreading through the 8th Army that Rommel himself was somehow physically omnipresent, that he could appear on any road, that he knew your position before you did. Winston Churchill was briefed on this memorandum. His response was to praise Rommel publicly in Parliament, specifically calling him a great general in a speech in January of 1942. The intention was to normalize the fear by naming it grandly. It backfired. Churchill's praise made Rommel larger, not smaller. When I first encountered this RAMC memorandum, described in secondary sources since the original classification hasn't been fully lifted on all copies, it reoriented the way I understood Rommel's early African campaigns, because the memorandum is not describing a tactical phenomenon. It's describing a psychological one. And what Rommel had understood, perhaps instinctively, was that in warfare at the divisional and corps level, the opponent's psychology is a variable that can be directly manipulated, not through propaganda, through tempo. If you move faster than the opponent can process, their mental model of the battlefield stops corresponding to physical reality, and a mental model that doesn't correspond to physical reality produces decisions that are wrong, not slightly wrong, structurally wrong, and structurally wrong decisions, all cascading through a headquarters, produce exactly the signal log of the 7th Armored Division in April of 1941. Orders, going to positions that have already been captured. The Battle of Tobruk's perimeter in April and May of 1941 is where this method encountered its first real failure, and the failure is instructive. The Australian 9th Division held Tobruk. The 9th Division's war diary, held at the Australian War Memorial under AWM-52, records the first major German assault on the 11th of April, with a brevity that is almost comical in contrast to the British signal chaos of the preceding week. 0430, enemy attacked from northwest with tanks and infantry. 0600, enemy repulsed. Approximately 18 tanks destroyed or captured. ER casualties, 7 wounded. The Australians were not new to war. They weren't psychologically disrupted by Rommel's pace. They had dug in. They had registered their anti-tank gun positions carefully. And when the attack came, they killed it. Rommel's method, constant pressure, never letting the enemy think, failed completely against an enemy that refused to think about retreating. The technical disparity at Tobruk deserves specific notation. By April of 1941, German armor losses in the attempted Tobruk assaults totaled approximately 35 tanks, destroyed or irreparably damaged, from a total operational pool that was already well below authorized strength due to the advance from El Akela. And German infantry casualties in the 3 major assault attempts on the Tobruk perimeter reached approximately 1,200 killed and wounded. These were not trivial losses for a corps-sized force operating 500 miles from its main supply base on improvised logistics. Rommel maintained the siege for 8 months. The Australians inside were supplied by sea, through a Royal Navy operation that ran under the continuous and serious threat of air and sea interdiction. They received fresh troops, food, ammunition, and water by destroyer runs that became known as the Tobruk Ferry. The logistics of the defense were sustainable. The logistics of the siege were not. What the Cyrenaica campaign of April 1941 established was both the upper and the lower bound of Rommel's operational method. The upper bound, against a psychologically vulnerable opponent with a slowed decision cycle, Rommel could generate advances that seemed to violate the laws of military physics. The lower bound, against a prepared opponent with a stable psychological state and adequate supply, the method produced costly stalemate. The question that neither Rommel nor his opponents had yet answered was which category any given opponent fell into, and whether there was a way to predict it in advance. The desert, as a theater, had a way of eventually answering that question for everyone. It just took time and fuel and losses that couldn't always be replaced. The 6 weeks of April and May 1941 established Rommel's name in a way that would persist long after the strategic results became ambiguous. If the psychological dimension of his reputation, that quality the RAMC memo was trying to analyze, would prove extraordinarily durable, it would be carried forward in British and American institutional memory to the point where, 2 years later, when Patton was given a corps in North Africa, one of the first things he was specifically told by his intelligence officers was that Rommel had left the theater, as if that mattered to the battle at hand, as if the ghost of 6 weeks in a desert had to be formally laid to rest before the actual fighting could begin. Chapter 5. Patton in the Wilderness, Louisiana, 1941. There is a document at the National Archives in Washington, filed under Record Group 337, Box 42, that is titled Exercise Umpire Report GHQ1, September of 1941. It concerns infractions and violations by the 2nd Armored Division during the Louisiana Maneuvers. Page 4, Item 7 reads as follows. Major General Patton's command vehicle was observed crossing a bridge marked destroyed by umpires at 1427 on September the 18th. When umpires halted the vehicle, Major General Patton stated, and this is a direct quotation, "That bridge is not destroyed. Your sign is wrong. Drive on." The vehicle proceeded. The umpire's handwritten annotation in the margin of his own report is a single sentence, and his column was through in 4 minutes. It would have worked. The Louisiana Maneuvers of September 1941 were the largest peacetime military exercises in American history to that point. Approximately 400,000 soldiers were committed across a maneuver area covering roughly 3,000 square miles of Louisiana and East Texas. The exercise was run by Brigadier General Leslie McNair, the Army's chief training officer, and its purpose was to test whether the United States Army's reorganized triangular division structure and new armored formations were ready for the war that everyone except some members of Congress knew was coming. Patton's 2nd Armored Division, 15,000 men, 390 tanks, 4,000 wheeled vehicles, was the most powerful mechanized force the United States had ever assembled for field exercises. It was also, in the estimation of the exercise planners, going to be a validation of doctrine. It turned out to be a demolition of it. Or in the exercise running from September 15th through September 19th, Patton's 2nd Armored covered 400 miles in 72 hours, a movement rate that Army doctrine had classified as physically impossible for a 15,000-man mechanized formation. He encircled Lieutenant General Ben Lear's 2nd Army Red Force through a southern hook that the exercise planners hadn't designed a counter for because the doctrine said it couldn't be done. His column's average movement rate of roughly 5.5 miles per hour, sustained over 3 days, required fuel, vehicle maintenance, and command coordination at levels that the Army's published standards said were unachievable in field conditions. And it required, on at least 2 documented occasions in the umpire reports, the creative interpretation of exercise rules that Patton didn't consider binding when they contradicted operational reality. He crossed the destroyed bridge. He used fuel from civilian filling stations. He won. McNair's personal diary, which is in the Library of Congress's McNair Papers, has an entry from the evening of September the 19th that I keep returning to because it captures something essential about the institutional predicament that Patton created for everyone around him. McNair wrote, "Patton again disregarded the fuel resupply rules. His division arrived at Shreveport having consumed fuel that does not exist on the ledger. When asked, he said he had pooled civilian gas stations. We cannot have our generals purchasing fuel from Standard Oil of Louisiana during training exercises. And yet, the results speak." That ellipsis in the middle of McNair's diary entry is one of the most telling pauses in American military history. Not because it's dramatic, because it shows a first-rate institutional mind being stopped cold by a problem it doesn't have a clean answer to. The gap between Patton's self-assessment and McNair's formal assessment of the same maneuvers is diagnostic. Patton's diary describes the Louisiana exercises as proving the invincibility of armor when led with audacity. McNair's formal assessment, filed with GHQ 3 weeks later, rates the 2nd Armored Division as excellent in offensive exploitation, seriously deficient in administrative and logistical discipline. Both evaluations are correct. They're just grading different tests. Now McNair is grading Patton against the standards the institution needs its divisions to meet in order to be manageable and sustainable across a theater of operations. Patton is grading himself against the standards a battle requires. In peacetime, McNair's test matters. In a war, you need both. And the Army's challenge through the next 4 years was finding a way to get Patton's results while managing his methods. It never fully solved that problem. The fuel story is worth following through because it has a long tail. Patton's logistics officer at 2nd Armored was then Lieutenant Colonel Walter Mueller. It was Mueller who actually arranged the civilian filling station resupply. 14 stations within a 40-mile radius, accessed without formal authorization, with IOUs signed, U.S. government, and eventually honored. And in Mueller's records of this improvisation, which I find genuinely underappreciated in most Patton accounts, are in the 2nd Armored Division's administrative files. What Mueller was doing wasn't theft or fraud. It was a specific kind of institutional creativity, looking at a requirement the system couldn't meet, identifying an alternative source outside the system, and processing it fast enough that the advance didn't stop. That skill, the ability to feed an army that was outrunning its own supply chain, would be practiced again, at vastly larger scale, in the summer of 1944, when Patton's Third Army was advancing across France at rates that made the Louisiana exercise look modest. To me, The most telling detail of the Louisiana maneuvers isn't the speed or the bridge or the civilian fuel. It's a note that Marshall wrote in his personal files in November of 1941, which you can read at the George C. Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. Marshall was reviewing the Louisiana results along with everything else on his desk. Pearl Harbor was 6 weeks away, though no one knew it. He wrote, "Patton, frontline command only. No theater command without proven staff discipline. One sentence. No elaboration." Marshall was one of the most precise men in American military history. He didn't use extra words. That sentence isn't a dismissal. It's a management plan. And it's a management plan that acknowledges Patton's value while identifying his liability with surgical accuracy. Marshall had figured out, from reports and evaluations and from knowing Patton personally, exactly what the man was and exactly where he could be used. What Marshall couldn't know in November of 41 was how large the theater was going to get, and how badly it was going to need the thing Patton was. Patton's tactical doctrine at 2nd Armored during this period included something he called reconnaissance pull, a method in which forward scouts radioed back passable routes, and the main body moved toward the path of least resistance rather than toward a prefixed map objective. This was a significant conceptual departure from standard American armored doctrine, which was still largely built around the fixed objective model inherited from World War I's positional warfare. Rommel was doing something conceptually similar in the desert, all driven by different intellectual influences: Guderian's adaptation of Fuller's theories, the Austrian mountain warfare tradition, but arriving at a similar operational conclusion: that rigidity of objective in mobile armored warfare was a form of defeat. The interesting thing about Patton's reconnaissance pull is that it required the commander to trust his scouts, to delegate the shaping of the advance to men on the ground. Patton, who trusted almost no one's tactical judgment except his own, had to discipline himself to use his own method. His subordinates noted, in oral histories collected after the war, that he wasn't always successful at it. The Louisiana Maneuvers ended on September the 28th, 1941. The formal exercise reports were filed, the debriefings were held, and the Army took away several important lessons about combined arms operations, communications, and the organizational demands of large-scale maneuver. Pearl Harbor happened 10 weeks later. Patton, who had been publicly visible and operationally successful during Louisiana, was given command of the 1st Armored Corps at Indio, California in December of 1941. He spent the next several months training troops in the Mojave Desert. It wasn't where he wanted to be. It was, in retrospect, exactly where he needed to be, learning the desert, learning logistics in conditions of heat and distance, building the physical and institutional knowledge that a desert campaign would require. He didn't know there was going to be a desert campaign, but the preparation happened anyway. The question that Louisiana raised, and that the war would spend 4 years answering, was whether an officer who excelled by breaking rules could be managed by an institution that ran on them. The Army's answer, worked out through multiple relief threats, actual reassignments, and at least one serious consideration of permanent removal from command, was yes, but barely, and at significant institutional cost, and only because the results kept justifying the effort. That's not a comfortable institutional conclusion. It's an honest one. Chapter 6, Gazala, the Apex and the Crack. At 0347, on the 28th of May, 1942, a teleprinter tape was printed at 8th Army headquarters in the Egyptian desert. The tape is still in the National Archives at Kew, filed under WO169/3923. It reads as follows: Ritchie to G, HQ Cairo, Rommel moving south of known minefield. Stop situation unclear. Stop will advise. Stop. The signal was received at GHQ at 4:12 in the morning. By 6 o'clock, Rommel's 3 Panzer divisions had passed south of the Bir Hachaim minefield, turned north, and begun a wide encircling sweep around the right flank of the entire 8th Army. Will advise. When the situation requires immediate action and the commander sends a message promising future communication, something has already gone wrong. The Gazala line, which the 8th Army had spent several months constructing through the Libyan desert southwest of Tobruk, was a defensive system of considerable technical sophistication. It ran approximately 40 miles south from the coast near Gazala to an anchor position at Bir Hacheim, held by a Free French brigade. The line consisted of minefields up to 5 miles deep, boxes, fortified brigade-sized positions, connected by wire and mines but not by continuous trench lines, and mobile armored reserves intended to counterattack any breakthrough. On paper, it was a modern elastic defense designed specifically against the kind of armored envelopment that Rommel had used so effectively in 1941. The problem, and this is the problem that 8th Army headquarters would wrestle with for the entire Battle of Gazala, was that elastic defense requires coordinated command, and 8th Army's command structure in May of 1942 was not coordinated. It was layered, bureaucratic, and fractally slow. Rommel's battle plan was called Operation Venezia, and it called for a 50-mile night march around the southern end of the British minefield, followed by a dawn attack northward that would roll up the 8th Army's unprotected right flank. The operation's timing was 12 hours late due to navigation errors in the dark. Navigating by compass across featureless desert terrain at night, with column after column of vehicles trying to maintain formation, proved harder in practice than on the planning map. By dawn on the 28th, instead of being north of the British position, the Afrika Korps was still east of Bir Hacheim, well south of where the plan required. Rommel improvised. This is worth noting with some precision. The operation that succeeded was not the operation that was planned. The Afrika Korps' actual battle reports, held at the Bundesarchiv under RH 19 August/31, show a series of improvisations driven by the 12-hour delay. Rommel's staff officer Major Schrapfer later wrote that the general described the operation differently afterward than it was directed during. This is not a damning observation. It's a human one. Successful commanders often reconstruct their decisions in retrospect as more deliberate than they were. What followed over the next 3 weeks is one of the most complex and violent armored battles of the war. By the 29th of May, Rommel found himself temporarily encircled. His advance had pushed through a gap in the British minefield, but his supply line was now running through a corridor under British fire, and his fuel was running out. He punched a hole back through the minefield to create a direct supply lane, establishing a position his troops called the Cauldron, a rough semicircle of territory inside the British defensive system. The British response was to attack the Cauldron on 3 successive days, with armored brigades committed piecemeal rather than simultaneously. On each day, the attack was defeated in detail. The 8th Army had more tanks than Rommel throughout this period, a fact that the official casualty and equipment records confirm conclusively, and it used them worse. I want to focus for a moment on the British armored commitment during the Cauldron battles because it's the clearest diagnostic of what was wrong with 8th Army in mid-1942. 3 separate armored brigades attacked the Cauldron on 3 separate days: the 1st, the 32nd, and the 22nd Armored Brigades. And no 2 of them attacked simultaneously. None of them had adequate infantry support. None of them had the benefit of a coordinated artillery preparation. Each attack was destroyed before it could develop enough mass to threaten the German positions. Rommel didn't have to be brilliant against these attacks. He just had to be present, which he was, directing the anti-tank screen from his command vehicle with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing exactly this for 2 years. The 8th Army was fighting on Rommel's terms because it didn't know how to impose its own. On the 21st of June, 1942, Rommel sent a signal to OKW at 9:43 in the morning. The signal in the Bundesarchiv under RH 19 August/32 reads, Tobruk gefallen, über 30,000 Gefangenen. Tobruk has fallen, over 30,000 prisoners. Hitler's response, sent by return signal, was a field marshal's baton. At 49 years old, Rommel became the youngest field marshal in German history. Hermann Göring sent champagne to celebrate. Rommel sent it back. He sent a signal to Kasserine instead, which is quoted in multiple post-war accounts, and which Kasserine himself confirmed in his post-war memoirs. I have asked the Führer for Malta. He said no. Without Malta, everything I do hereafter is a gamble. Read that signal carefully. Rommel knew, on the day of his greatest triumph, exactly where the structural flaw was. He understood that his supply situation, already the theater's defining problem, could only be resolved by neutralizing the British base at Malta, which controlled the Mediterranean sea lanes. He asked, he was refused, and he told Kasserine, and clearly and without apparent self-delusion, what the refusal would cost. When I was working through the secondary literature on Gazala, and there's a great deal of it, I kept noticing a pattern in how the fall of Tobruk is explained. Churchill's memoir, The Hinge of Fate, attributes the garrison's collapse partly to poor morale. General H.B. Clopper, who commanded the garrison, wrote in his after-action report that morale was adequate but materially outgunned. The British Parliamentary Inquiry of 1942, chaired by Sir John Wardlaw Milne, concluded that the primary cause was defective higher command, specifically the failure to coordinate a counterattack before Rommel could consolidate inside the perimeter. 3 separate official or semi-official sources, all describing the same event, all reaching different primary conclusions. That's not unusual in history, it's the norm. What it tells you is that the fall of Tobruk, like most military catastrophes, had several simultaneous causes, and the argument about which one was primary is often a proxy argument about institutional and personal responsibility. The technical balance of the Gazala battle is worth recording with precision. The German 50mm PaK 38 and the newly introduced 75mm PaK 40, the anti-tank guns that did the heaviest work against British armor at Gazala, fired tungsten-cored Pisur 40 rounds at approximately 1,000 meters per second. At 500 meters, the PaK 40 could penetrate 106 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. The British Valentine and Matilda tanks, and which still formed a significant portion of 8th Army's armored strength, had 60 to 65 millimeters of frontal armor. The technical equation that had been reversed since the PA 36's failure against the Matilda at Arras in 1940 was now reversed again, in Germany's favor. The same 8th Army that had been tactically paralyzed by the Matilda's armor in 1940 was now facing a gun that would go through that armor like it wasn't there. The capture of Tobruk on June 21st brought Rommel something that, given the theater's permanent supply deficit, was more valuable than the field marshal's baton: 1,400 tons of canned goods, 2,000 tons of fuel, and enough motor transport to immediately resume the advance. This captured material, not German logistics, not Italian shipping, and not any improvement in the supply chain, funded the drive to El Alamein. Without it, Rommel physically could not have moved his armor east of the Egyptian border. The irony is that his greatest strategic asset in June of 1942 was a British garrison's abandoned supplies. He was, at the apex of his career, still dependent on capturing what he couldn't be given. Gazala was Rommel at his finest and, simultaneously, the point at which his operational method exceeded what the strategic situation could sustain. He knew this. His signal to Kasserine says he knew this. He advanced anyway, because his operational instinct and Hitler's enthusiasm and the sheer momentum of a 2-year career built on advancing, regardless of what the logisticians said, all pointed east. Or the word culminating point, the operational concept describing the moment when an attacker's power equals the defender's, after which further advance becomes strategically counterproductive, was not formalized in doctrine until decades later. But the concept existed. Rommel crossed it on June 22, 1942. He just kept moving east. Chapter 7. El Alamein, the Wall. Rommel never broke in the Ultra Transcript collection at the Bletchley Park Trust Archive, filed under the reference BP26/7/1942-A. There is a decrypted German signal dated the 1st of July, 1942, transmitted at 2:30 in the morning. It is Rommel's personal request to Kasserine for emergency fuel and ammunition. The signal, translated from German Enigma cipher and stripped of its source before distribution, auto-reads, Panzerarmee in extremis, cannot continue operations beyond 48 hours without immediate resupply. Rommel. British 8th Army received a copy of this signal at 4:15 the same morning. General Claude Auchinleck, commanding the 8th Army from his tactical headquarters at El Alamein, read it with his morning briefing. Rommel never knew. The most confidential operational signal of his career had been delivered in clean English translation to his opponent's breakfast table. The position at El Alamein was not chosen by accident. It was chosen because of geography, specifically because the 40-mile gap between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression, a vast salt flat impassable to vehicles, made it the one location in the western desert where a defensive line couldn't be outflanked. Every previous British position in the desert had been flanked. Mersa Matruh had been flanked. The Gazala line had been flanked. El Alamein couldn't be. The flank was the Qattara Depression, and the Qattara Depression was 100 feet below sea level, salt-crusted, and would swallow a tank to its turret. For the first time in the North African campaign, Rommel was being asked to fight a battle that his signature method, the wide encircling sweep, the advance into the opponent's rear, structurally could not produce. Rommel arrived at the El Alamein position on the 1st of July, with 55 operational tanks out of an authorized complement of 600. His infantry divisions had approximately 7,000 effective soldiers, roughly 44% of authorized strength. His artillery was critically short of ammunition. His medical officer had placed him on a monitoring protocol for low blood pressure, fainting episodes, and what the records describe as generalized physical exhaustion. He was attacking a prepared defensive position, 40 miles wide, that couldn't be bypassed, with less than a reinforced division's worth of operational armor, 500 miles from his nearest functioning supply base, on a logistics chain that his own signals described as in extremis. The miracle was being asked to run one more time. It had very little left to give. Auchinleck's response to this situation was shaped, more than any official history has been comfortable acknowledging, by what his intelligence staff was reading in decrypted German signals. On 3 successive days in early July, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd, Auchinleck repositioned his reserves to exactly the sector that Rommel's ultra-decrypted orders indicated would be attacked. 3 times, Rommel struck into prepared positions instead of a thinning line. The Africa Corps' operational diary, which records events without the retrospective editing that memoirs invite, notes with growing bewilderment that 8th Army appears to anticipate our movements with uncanny accuracy. That was not a strategic insight on the diary writer's part. It was just an observation, but it was the correct observation. There is a genuine historiographical argument here that I think deserves honest treatment rather than diplomatic elision. The British official history of the Mediterranean campaign, written by General I.S.O. Playfair and published in the 1960s, and credits Auchinleck with superior tactical flexibility at First Alamein, with reading the battle correctly, repositioning reserves intelligently, and imposing a defensive coherence that 8th Army had consistently failed to achieve against Rommel before. John Keegan, in The Battle for History, published in 1995, argued that this attribution is partly a cover narrative, that Auchinleck's flexibility was substantially structural rather than personal, that he was, in Keegan's phrase, reading Rommel's mail. Both things are true, and they're not mutually exclusive. Auchinleck did make good decisions. He also made them with information his opponent didn't know he had. The question of how much credit belongs to the general and how much belongs to the mathematicians in Buckinghamshire isn't a politically comfortable one for an official history to answer. Keegan answered it anyway. When I was working through the ultra decrypts alongside the 8th Army's operational orders for July of 1942, what struck me most wasn't the tactical information in the intercepts, though that was precise and consequential. It was the personal signals. Rommel's one-time pads for communication with Hitler were never broken by Bletchley. His operational traffic was read almost daily. His personal correspondence, sent through a different cipher system, was not. What this means is that Churchill and Auchinleck could read Rommel's battle orders, while the letters he was writing to his wife Lucy, letters describing his physical state, his genuine despair about the supply situation, his private conviction that the theater was unwinnable without Malta, were invisible to them. The public Rommel they were reading was the operational commander, the private Rommel, who was writing to Lucy on the 25th of July. I am sick, Lou, not just the body. I cannot remember the last time I knew where my supply column was. That Rommel they couldn't see. That letter, incidentally, was censored in B.H. Little Hart's post-war English edition of the Rommel papers. The full German text, Krieg ohne Hass, preserves it. The Australian 9th Division's operations in the northern sector of the Alamein line during July of 1942 represent the clearest demonstration that Rommel's method had genuinely stopped working. On the 10th of July, and again at multiple points through the month, Australian attacks in the coastal sector, correctly timed because Ultra had shown Rommel shifting his armor south, hit German and Italian positions that had been stripped of reserves. The defense had become the offense. For the first time, Rommel was reacting to events rather than creating them. He was managing a battlefield that someone else was shaping. His operational diary for this period has a quality of increasing frustration that is distinct from the confident improvisation of the Cyrenaica campaigns. He wasn't adapting to chaos. He was adapting to a plan he couldn't see. The technical detail of how the Ultra advantage was converted into tactical action is worth explaining because it wasn't automatic. Bletchley's Hut 6 was breaking the Afrika Korps' Chaffinch Enigma key almost daily during July of 1942. The specific machine setting changed every 24 hours for operational traffic. In practice, 8th Army intelligence officers were reading Afrika Korps orders approximately 6 to 12 hours after transmission, sometimes before the intended recipients in the field had processed them. But the intelligence had to be handled carefully. If Auchinleck responded too precisely to every intercept, the Germans might deduce that their signals were compromised. The trick was to use the intelligence to shape positioning and reserves without responding in ways that exposed the source. This is a considerable cognitive and institutional demand, knowing what the enemy is going to do and deliberately choosing not to respond perfectly in order to protect the knowledge that you know. Rommel's physical deterioration through July of 1942 is documented in his divisional surgeon's notes and in his own diary, and it matters operationally because his command method was unusually dependent on personal presence. He didn't run battles from a map table at headquarters. He ran them from a half-track at the front, issuing direct orders, absorbing information through personal observation. When the man at the front was suffering from low blood pressure and fainting episodes, when his own physician was recommending medical leave, the method degraded in ways that a more conventionally headquartered commander's method wouldn't have. On the 30th of July, he wrote in his diary that he needed 3 months of rest and resupply before he could resume offensive operations. He requested sick leave. OKW denied the request and told him Hitler expected the advance on Alexandria to resume within days. He stayed. First Alamein ended not with a decisive engagement, but with exhaustion, mutual, physical, operational. Rommel's force couldn't advance. Auchinleck's force couldn't convert its positional advantage into a pursuit that destroyed the Afrika Korps. The line held, the line hardened, and over the following 3 months, as the arithmetic that would eventually determine the outcome of the Desert Campaign began to shift irreversibly. Ships were bringing more tanks, more guns, more men, and more ammunition to the British side. Rommel was receiving a fraction of what he'd requested, losing a larger fraction to British submarines, and fighting a supply math that his signals had been accurately describing as impossible since his second week in theater. The first battle of El Alamein is remembered as Auchinleck stopping Rommel. The more complete story is that the desert, the mathematics of supply across a bombed sea lane, and a group of people breaking codes in the English countryside had been stopping Rommel for months. Auchinleck was the final instrument of a process that had begun in the Italian supply archives in December of 1940. Now Chapter 8, Torch, Patton's First Fire. The contingency planning file for Operation Torch, Western Task Force, sits in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archive in Washington in Box 109-C. Clipped to the inside cover is a handwritten note, undated, in Patton's handwriting. It reads, "Hewitt says it can't be done if the surf is above 8 feet. I say it will be done regardless of surf. File this under. Arguments I have already won. On the morning of November the 8th, 1942, the surf at Fadala Beach, Morocco, was approximately 8.5 feet. Patton landed anyway. In the first 4 hours of the assault, 47 landing craft were destroyed or disabled by the surf. The note was wrong about winning the argument. It wasn't wrong about the landing happening. And Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of French North Africa, launched on the 8th of November, 1942, simultaneously across 3 landing areas: Casablanca in Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and Algiers further east. The strategic purpose was to establish an Allied presence in northwest Africa, link up with British forces advancing from Egypt after the Second Battle of El Alamein, and squeeze Axis forces in a vice between 2 fronts. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, responsible for the Casablanca sector, the only purely American element of the operation, and the only one approaching from the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean. This meant a 4,500-mile transit across the open Atlantic, maintaining radio silence for 13 days, with 24,500 men, 250 tanks, and a total cargo manifest of 89,247 tons. Not one ship was lost to submarine attack during the crossing. That wasn't luck. It was convoy discipline and routing intelligence, and it was the longest amphibious assault approach in history to that point. The planning for Torch's Western Task Force was compressed to a degree that modern joint planners would regard with alarm. From the initial order to execution was approximately 8 weeks. In that 8 weeks, Patton's headquarters had to coordinate loading plans for 102 transport ships in combat loading sequence, meaning the things needed first ashore were loaded last, the heaviest equipment loaded deepest, with a Naval Task Force commander, Rear Admiral Henry Hewitt, who had his own doctrinal requirements and his own institutional culture and his own entirely reasonable professional concern about the surf conditions off the Moroccan coast. The loading manifest that resulted, cross-indexed by unit, priority, and beach zone, was subsequently circulated by Eisenhower's headquarters as a planning template for future operations. It was the work primarily of Patton's logistics officer, Colonel Walter Muller, the same man who had been buying fuel from Louisiana, filling stations 14 months earlier. Muller's instinct for making a supply system work outside its own rules was becoming institutionally codified. Hewitt's objections about the surf weren't unreasonable. The standard operational threshold for amphibious landings using the Higgins boat, the LCVP, landing craft vehicle and personnel, which was the primary assault vessel, was a surf height of 3.5 feet for comfortable operations, with 5 feet considered the functional limit for maintaining formation and avoiding broaching. 8.5 feet was well beyond doctrine. Patton's response to doctrine, as the umpire report from the Louisiana Maneuvers had already established, was consistent. He would evaluate the doctrine against the operational requirement and override it if the requirement was sufficiently urgent. November was the last month before Atlantic weather made the Moroccan coast practically inaccessible to large-scale amphibious operations. If the landing didn't happen in November, it didn't happen until spring. Patton decided 47 destroyed landing craft was an acceptable arithmetic. The M4 Sherman tank made its significant operational debut at Torch. This is worth noting technically because the Sherman's design represented a genuine improvement over the M3 Grant it largely replaced, specifically the 360-degree turret-mounted 75mm M3 gun, replacing the hull-mounted 75 of the Grant, which had required the entire vehicle to be oriented toward a target for the main gun to bear. The Sherman's vertical armor arrangement, 70mm of rolled homogeneous plate at 47 degrees on the front hull, was sufficient to defeat most Axis anti-tank weapons in November of 1942. What Torch didn't reveal, because the Germans weren't present in force to exploit it, was the Sherman's catastrophic tendency to catch fire when penetrated, caused by the stowage of its 75mm ammunition in racks on the hull floor and sides. The crews in Tunisia and Sicily the following year would learn this. Torch was too easy for the lesson to register. The French garrison at Casablanca had a standing order from Pétain's Vichy government to resist any Allied landing. They did initially. The shore batteries at El Honk fired on the transports offshore. The French Navy sent surface vessels out of the harbor, and there was genuine fighting on the beaches and in the approaches to the city. But the French situation was tangled with politics that the military history tends to skip past. Vichy France was simultaneously a nominally sovereign government, a German client state, and a country in which a significant portion of the officer corps either secretly sympathized with the Allies or was waiting to see which way the balance tipped before committing. U.S. diplomat Robert Murphy had been conducting secret negotiations with elements of the French command for months before the landing. The Vichy commander in Morocco, General Noguez, had a standing order to resist and a private channel to Murphy suggesting he might not. When Patton, in full-dress uniform and medals, arrived personally at the French headquarters to negotiate the armistice on the 11th of November, violating Eisenhower's direct instructions about the armistice process, he was walking into a room where the decision had largely been made before he arrived. When I was reading through the primary source accounts of the Casablanca armistice negotiations, I found myself slightly unsatisfied with how most Patton biographies handle this episode. The standard narrative is, Patton arrived, Patton intimidated the French, Patton's personal force of will produced the surrender. The actual diplomatic record, specifically the Murphy Papers, described in post-war accounts and in the State Department archive, suggests the French garrison had already been prepared for negotiation by 14 days of Murphy's back-channel work. Patton's visit was the formal closing of a door that had been opened by professional diplomats he didn't know existed. His instinct to go personally, in uniform, with medals, was tactically sound. It sent the right signal about American seriousness. But the credit belongs more evenly distributed than his diary suggests. What Eisenhower's private cable to Marshall captured most accurately was the gap between what Torch achieved and how it achieved it. The cable, in the National Archives under RG 331 I0-5 file, says, Patton landed, but the operation was not pretty. He says it was planned this way. His staff says otherwise. That is a precise formulation of a problem that would recur throughout Patton's career. The gap between the result, which was usually excellent, and the process, which was usually chaotic and frequently involved violations of orders or doctrine that Patton subsequently described as deliberate planning choices. He wasn't lying exactly. He was applying retrospective order to genuine chaos. Because the alternative, admitting that the operation worked despite rather than because of the planning, would have undermined the authority he needed for the next operation. It's a comprehensible institutional behavior. It's also the reason his superiors never quite trusted his after-action reports. The Western Task Force's performance at Torch established several things simultaneously. It proved that the United States Army could mount a complex amphibious operation across 4,500 miles of ocean and land under fire without catastrophic failure. It proved that Patton could get troops ashore. It also established, in the signal traffic between Patton and Eisenhower over the subsequent 2 weeks, as Patton pushed against every organizational constraint the Allied command structure tried to impose, that managing Patton inside a coalition command was going to require sustained and deliberate institutional effort. He kept pushing. He always kept pushing. The question that Eisenhower and Marshall were working out, through Torch and through everything that came after it, was whether the pushing was worth the management cost. In November of 1942, the verdict was, ask again after Tunisia. Chapter 9. Kasserine, the Education of an Army. There are photographs taken by a German Heinkel, Hay 111 reconnaissance aircraft on the 18th of February 1943 that are in the Bundesarchiv Bildarchiv collection under reference Bild 101 I-75-02884-10A. They show the main road through the Kasserine Pass in western Tunisia. On that road, stretching as far north as the camera's focal length allows, there are American vehicles. Not burning vehicles, not destroyed vehicles, just abandoned ones. trucks with their hoods raised, half-tracks nosed into drainage ditches at angles that suggest rapid departure rather than combat damage. One M3 half-track has its rear loading gate open, as though its crew stepped out to check something and didn't come back. The technical phrase in the American after-action report for this category of loss is crew abandoned non-combat loss. The honest translation, which the report doesn't use, is the crews ran. And then, in the margin of the umpire's copy of that report, in someone's handwriting, it's a single annotation: this cannot happen again. What happened at Kasserine Pass between the 14th and the 23rd of February, 1943, was not a surprise in the sense of being undetected. American intelligence had identified the Axis buildup in the Fide Pass area. The question was whether the attack, when it came, would be directed north toward the British First Army sector or west through the American Second Corps sector toward the supply bases and airfields around Tebessa. The answer was west, toward the Americans, and the decision to attack specifically in the Second Corps sector was made by Field Marshal Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim as a deliberate choice to hit the weakest point in the Allied line. American troops were newer to combat than the British. Their equipment was newer. Their command arrangements were still being worked out. Rommel and von Arnim read this correctly. The American command failure at Kasserine has several distinct layers, and conflating them produces a muddier picture than any single one of them deserves. The first layer is the positional failure, combat command. A of the 1st Armored Division was ordered to relieve an encircled infantry position at Sidi Bou Zid on the 14th of February, without air support, without artillery preparation, and without reconnaissance establishing where the German anti-tank screen was positioned. 2 tank battalions, comprising roughly 100 tanks, advanced across open terrain into prepared defensive positions. Both battalions were destroyed before reaching their objective. The 1st Armored Division's war diary records the loss with a clinical precision that is worse than editorializing. CC-A rendered combat ineffective. Battalion-level command elements destroyed. Vehicles total, 94 lost. 94 tanks in one afternoon, destroyed not because the tank was outclassed, but because the operation was ordered without the basic combined arms framework that doctrine required. The second layer is the command layer. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps from a headquarters position approximately 70 miles behind the front, had spent 3 weeks having his engineers excavate a command bunker in the face of a cliff near Tebessa. The bunker was deep, reinforced, and entirely inaccessible to the forward units whose communications it was supposed to coordinate. In Eisenhower's own inspection notes from his visit after Kasserine described Fredendall's installation as a monument to fear. That phrase is precise and damning and accurate. Fredendall was issuing orders to unit commanders using a personal map reference code he had invented himself, which his subordinates had to decode before they could act on. In a fluid battle, where the margin between adequate response time and catastrophic delay was measured in tens of minutes, Fredendall's headquarters was adding an encryption layer that no one had asked for, and everyone had to work around. There's a disagreement in the sources about the German side of Kasserine that I think deserves honest treatment. Rommel's post-war account, in the Rommel Papers, describes the operation as a decisive operational victory, frustrated only by German High Command's failure to exploit the breakthrough more aggressively. The Italian Comando Supremo records and the German Army Group Africa Operational Diary for the same period tell a somewhat different story. Rommel halted voluntarily on the 22nd of February before any order to halt arrived from above, because his fuel state would not support further advance beyond Kasserine into the Algerian interior. The heroic narrative, Rommel thwarted by political timidity, is partially a post-war construction layered over a material reality. He stopped because he didn't have enough petrol to continue. The same problem that had defined every previous operation of his African campaign had arrived again, at what should have been his greatest moment of exploitation. The American losses at Kasserine were precise and large: 300 killed, 3,000 captured, 183 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 194 half-tracks, 512 trucks. German casualties were approximately 989, killed and wounded, with roughly 20 tanks lost. The personnel loss ratio was approximately 3-1 in Germany's favor. The armor ratio was close to 10-1. It was the worst American defeat of the European theater. When Eisenhower visited the aftermath and filed his assessment to Marshall, the cable was 1 paragraph long and contained one decision. Fredendall must go. I have someone in mind. He didn't name Patton in that cable. He didn't need to. And Marshall knew who was coming. What I find most analytically significant about Kasserine, more than the tactical failures, more than Fredendall's bunker, more than the loss ratios, is the American institutional response to it. The Army did not attempt to explain Kasserine away. It didn't write a narrative that attributed the defeat primarily to German excellence. It conducted a specific named, documented post-mortem and then changed doctrine, training, and command assignments with a speed and systemic thoroughness that few armies in history have matched. Tank destroyer doctrine was formally revised in February of 1943, based on the specific failure at Sidi Bouzid, where tank destroyers had been positioned in static rear defense instead of forward mobile reserve. The new Field Manual FM 18-5 all rushed through in the weeks after Kasserine, mandated forward placement in ambush positions along likely enemy avenues of approach. That is not a marginal change. That is an institutional admission that the previous doctrine was wrong, converted into a binding order within weeks of the battle that proved it. When I compare the American institutional response to Kasserine with the German response to comparable setbacks, and there were comparable setbacks at El Alamein and in Russia, the contrast is stark. The Wehrmacht's response to operational failure was increasingly to find individual commanders to blame, transfer them, or execute them, without systemic revision of the doctrine that had produced the failure. The American Army's response was to systematically identify what had gone wrong, document it, and change the relevant procedures. This is not a romantic observation about democratic armies versus authoritarian ones. It's an institutional observation about learning rates, and learning rates, compounded over 3 years of industrial warfare, determine outcomes. Rommel left North Africa for the last time on the 9th of March, 1943, officially for medical treatment in Germany. His physician's notes, held at the Württemberg State Archive under E397/13, record low blood pressure, fainting episodes, and nasal infection, severe enough to require hospitalization. He never commanded in Africa again. The man the Americans had been briefing against, the figure whose psychological weight the RAMC had formally documented in 1941, was on a hospital bed in Germany when Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters. Even the ghost was gone. The problem that remained? The actual German army in Tunisia, now commanded by von Arnim, still formidable, still well equipped with artillery and anti-tank guns, still capable of serious resistance, was more tractable than the myth. It was also the problem Patton was about to address. Chapter 10. Patton's 10 Days, Rebuilding 2 Corps. 2 Corps. Administrative Order. Number 1, dated the 7th of March, 1943, is in the National Archives in Washington under Record Group 407, in the 2nd Corps records. It is 3 pages long. The first page covers uniform standards. The second page covers saluting requirements and helmet-wearing regulations. The third page details the correct method of digging a field latrine, including depth specifications, placement relative to sleeping areas, and the requirement for a cover board to be fitted before the position is considered complete. This order was issued 2 days after Patton assumed command of 2nd Corps. The men receiving it had, in some cases, spent the preceding week retreating from Kasserine under fire, watching their units disintegrate, burying friends, and their new commanding general's first administrative act was to write about latrine covers. The soldiers hated him within 48 hours. Within 2 weeks, they had started to believe in themselves again. The logic of the latrine order, and it does have a logic, though it wasn't the kind that the men receiving it were in a mood to appreciate, was explained by Patton himself in his diary entry for the 7th of March. He wrote, "Arrived 2nd Corps. morale bad, equipment dirty, men walking without helmets, and staff without maps. First act, fined every officer in sight for uniform violations. Total, $400. Second act, ordered all vehicles camouflaged by 0600 tomorrow. Third act, issued 2 weeks training schedule. The Corps will be ready. The diary is private, and private documents tend toward unguarded honesty. Patton's theory, as the diary makes clear, was that a soldier who maintains standards in adversity has made a psychological commitment to the possibility of survival and victory. A soldier who doesn't maintain them has, at some level, stopped believing either is possible. The latrine wasn't about sanitation. It was about the decision to act as though the next day was going to happen and was going to require a functioning army. The 10 days between Patton's assumption of command on March the 7th and his first significant offensive action at El Gueter on March the 17th are documented in extraordinary detail across 3 separate record sets. Patton's diary provides the commander's perspective. The unit war diaries of the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions and the 1st Armored Division provide the operational layer. And the oral history archive at the University of Illinois, which collected interviews with Second Corps veterans in the 1960s and 70s, provides something neither of those official sources can: what it felt like, from the enlisted perspective, to have Patton arrive. One of those oral histories, from Sergeant Floyd Cantrell of the 1st Armored Division, describes finding the latrine order posted on a bulletin board near the division's maintenance area. Cantrell's recorded words are, "We thought he was crazy. Later, I understood. He was telling us the war hadn't beaten us. We were still soldiers. Soldiers dig latrines right." The retrospective clarity of that assessment took time to develop. In the first week, the assessment was less generous. The material transformation of Second Corps in 10 days is as significant as the psychological one, and it gets less credit in most accounts. In those 10 days, the Corps received and distributed 4,200 replacement vehicles, 380 replacement tanks, and 15,000 replacement soldiers, the largest single American reinforcement operation in the African theater to that point. This was not Patton's doing, in the sense that he didn't conjure the replacements from nowhere. They were allocated by Eisenhower's headquarters and the theater supply system, but the distribution was Patton's, and more specifically, it was Colonel Walter Muller's, the logistics officer who had been with Patton since the Louisiana Maneuvers, who by this point had an almost preternatural ability to move large quantities of material to the right place in less time than doctrine suggested was possible. The army that attacked at El Gueter on March the 17th was materially a different force from the one that had run at Kasserine. The men were largely the same men. The equipment was largely different equipment. El Gueter, on the 23rd of March, was the first engagement in North Africa in which American infantry and armor operated in genuine combined arms coordination, with artillery suppression, infantry fixing the defensive position, and armor exploiting the breach, against a German armored counterattack. The 10th Panzer Division attacked the American positions at El Gueter at approximately 0600 that morning, with approximately 50 tanks and motorized infantry. The American defensive position had been prepared the day before, with tank destroyer units, now positioned per the revised FM 18-5 doctrine in forward ambush positions rather than rear defense, waiting along the likely approaches. The 10th Panzer was hit by artillery preparation at approximately 0500 before the attack began. It was hit by the tank destroyer screen as it entered the American defensive zone. It was hit by infantry anti-tank weapons at close range. The attack was stopped, not without American casualties. The after-action report records 47 killed and 196 wounded, but stopped. Patton's after-action report on El Gueter states that the 10th Panzer Division was decisively defeated with heavy losses. The German 10th Panzer Division's own records in the Bundesarchiv under RH 27/10 describe the engagement as a costly tactical setback requiring operational repositioning. These are not dramatically incompatible assessments, but Patton's language is more categorical than the evidence supports. The 10th Panzer Division remained combat effective. It was not destroyed, it was hurt, and it withdrew. At Patton's version, decisively defeated, is the version that appears in most subsequent accounts, because Patton was the one writing the report that went to Army Group headquarters. This pattern, accurate about method, somewhat inflated about results, appears consistently across his career. It was a form of institutional self-promotion that his superiors understood for what it was and discounted accordingly, while still recognizing that the underlying achievement was genuine. What I find most revealing about the 10-day reformation of Second Corps isn't the visible part, the fines, the latrine orders, the uniform inspections that Patton's legend is built on. It's the invisible part, happening simultaneously in a tent somewhere in the Second Corps rear area, where Brigadier General Hugh Gaffey, Patton's deputy chief of staff, was drafting a Joint Armored Infantry Artillery Operations Manual. This document, which I came across referenced in the Second Corps' administrative files at the National Archives, would become the template for American armor doctrine in the 1944 campaigns. It was never formally attributed to Gaffey. It was filed under Second Corps administrative records rather than doctrinal publications. It was rediscovered in the NARA stacks in 1987. Gaffey was, in most accounts, a staff officer in Patton's shadow. The manual suggests he was also doing some of the most consequential doctrinal thinking of the African campaign. The friction between Patton and the Allied command structure began immediately and didn't stop. General Harold Alexander, commanding 18th Army Group and therefore Patton's direct superior, Louis assigned Second Corps primarily to supporting roles, protecting flanks, securing lines of communication, rather than the offensive operations Patton wanted. Patton filed formal protests at Corps level, arguing that American troops needed to attack to rebuild their confidence after Kasserine. Alexander's position, which was reasonable given Second Corps' recent performance, was that American units needed demonstrated reliability before being given independent offensive missions. The argument was never fully resolved before the Tunisian campaign ended in May. It was the first articulation of a tension between Patton and the Allied coalition command structure that would run through Sicily, through France, through the Ardennes, all the way to the Elbe. Patton always wanted to attack. The coalition always wanted to coordinate. These two requirements were not as compatible as they sounded. The Tunisian campaign ended on the 13th of May, 1943, when the last organized Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed and approximately 240,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. Rommel was not among them. He had left Africa 2 months before. Von Arnim was captured. The Africa Corps, which had been the most formidable ground-fighting formation in the world 18 months earlier, marched into captivity in such numbers that Allied prison of war facilities were briefly overwhelmed. Patton had already moved on, assigned to plan the invasion of Sicily. He left Second Corps on April the 15th, handing it to Omar Bradley. He left it significantly better than he found it, harder, faster, all more coherent in its combined arms practice. And he left it without having resolved any of the questions about his own temperament and institutional reliability that had followed him since the Louisiana Umpire report. The latrine order had fixed the Corps. Nothing in Tunisia fixed Patton. Chapter 11, The Slap Heard Round the Command. The admission record for Private Charles Cool of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, filed at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital on the 3rd of August, 1943, is a single printed form with handwritten entries in the relevant fields. Ward, psychiatric. Admitting diagnosis, psychoneurosis, anxiety state, chronic. Temperature, 98.6 Fahrenheit. Blood pressure, 118/76. In notes from the attending physician, patient manifesting tremor, insomnia, inability to eat, combat flashbacks. Recommend minimum 2 weeks rest and observation. That file existed. It was at the hospital. It was in the ward Patton entered on the 3rd of August. The attending physician was present. Patton didn't ask for the file, and nobody handed it to him. The Sicilian campaign, Operation Husky, had been running for 3.5 weeks when Patton entered the 93rd Evacuation Hospital's psychiatric ward. The 7th Army, which Patton commanded, had performed well, better than Montgomery's Eighth Army in fact, by several operational metrics, though the comparison generated its own politics. Patton had conducted the campaign with a relentless offensive pressure that had frustrated Montgomery, confused the German defense, and captured Palermo. He had also been managing a casualty picture that was darker than the advance's speed suggested. The Seventh Army had suffered substantial losses in the fighting around Troina and in the approaches to Messina. By early August, American medical records were registering a significant number of what the Army's own field manual FM 851, published in 1942, classified as combat exhaustion cases, a medical category requiring medical response, distinct from cowardice. Patton had apparently read a great deal of military history. He had not read FM 851 carefully. When Patton entered the ward and confronted Kuhl, slapping him across the face, knocking off his helmet liner, and using language that the 3 nurses and 2 orderlies present, recorded in their testimony to the Army Inspector General, the physical facts of what happened are not in dispute. The IG investigation records, held at the National Archives under RG 159, Box 14, contain 5 eyewitness statements that are unanimous on the physical act. They differ on the precise words. One nurse records Patton saying, "You're a coward." Another records, "You're a goddamn disgrace." The legal distinction matters. The moral one, to Kuhl, probably didn't. He was lying in a hospital bed with documented tremor and combat flashbacks and a physician's written recommendation for 2 weeks' rest, and the commanding general of the Seventh Army slapped him in the face and told him he was a disgrace. Whatever Patton said exactly, that's what happened. And 7 days later, on the 10th of August, at the 15th Evacuation Hospital, the same event occurred with a second soldier, Private Paul Bennett, who had been diagnosed with malarial fever and exhaustion and had been in continuous combat operations for 4 years, longer in fact, than many of the officers who would subsequently evaluate Patton's conduct, was slapped and verbally threatened. This time, the regimental commander filed a formal complaint. The difference between the first and second incidents isn't that the first was unobserved. It's that the first incident was reported up channels with a certain hesitation. People didn't want to be the officer who reported a commanding general to the inspector general over a hospital visit, while the second produced a paper record that the chain of command couldn't ignore. Eisenhower received the complaint on the 16th of August. The gap between Eisenhower's public response and his private one is one of the most precisely documented examples of institutional conflict management in the American military record. His formal reprimand letter to Patton, filed at the Eisenhower Library in the Eisenhower-Patton Correspondence, Box 91, tells Patton the incident was deplorable and constitutes a serious charge, but states that he is not at this time considering relieving you of command. His private diary for the same week contains a passage that says something different. "I have thought seriously about relieving Patton. I decided not to, only because I cannot replace his offensive capability in time for Overlord. The strategic need overrides the personal failure." That diary entry is Eisenhower being honest with himself in a way that his official correspondence can't afford to be. He isn't forgiving Patton. He's making a calculation. And the calculation is, the theater needs this man more than it needs the institutional principle his conduct violated. To me, the most unsettling document in this entire episode isn't the IG report or Eisenhower's diary. It's Patton's own diary entry from the 3rd of August, written the same evening as the first incident. He writes, "I may have saved his soul." That sentence tells you more about the gap between Patton's self-conception and the reality in front of him than anything his critics wrote about him. He had walked into a psychiatric ward, encountered a soldier with a documented medical diagnosis, and interpreted what he saw as cowardice requiring correction rather than illness requiring treatment. The Army's own manual said it was illness. The attending physician's notes said it was illness. Patton had access to neither because he hadn't asked. And his diary tells us that if he had, he might not have changed his mind. He had a theory of human will, that it was sovereign over physical suffering, that the body could be commanded by a strong enough mind, that was both personally authentic and clinically wrong. the statistical context for the slapping incidents is important and is usually absent from the narrative accounts. In the 8 weeks of the Sicilian campaign, 7th Army reported 2,237 cases of battle fatigue or neuropsychiatric casualties. That represents approximately 4% of combat troops, a rate consistent with all subsequent Allied armies in the European theater across equivalent periods of sustained combat. Post-war studies established that roughly 1/3 of all combat veterans with more than 90 days of continuous frontline exposure develop clinically significant anxiety symptoms within 3 months. Kuhl had been in continuous combat. Bennett had been in combat for 4 years. They were experiencing a statistically predictable medical condition, documented and named in the Army's own medical regulations. Patton was the commanding general of the force producing those casualties. The rate at which his army was generating neuropsychiatric cases was not exceptional. His response to them was. The story reached 50 war correspondents by mid-August, 1943, by a voluntary agreement among the press corps, not a military order, not a legal restriction, a professional decision. They held it for 3 months. When the radio broadcaster Drew Pearson broke it on the 21st of November, the delayed disclosure triggered immediate congressional inquiry and a cascade of calls for Patton's relief. The Army's institutional management of the incident is, in its way, as revealing as the incident itself. The delay wasn't suppression in any coercive sense. It was a press corps making a judgment that the story's immediate publication would damage the war effort more than its delayed publication would. That judgment is contestable, and it was contested at the time. But it's worth noting that the same press corps that voluntarily sat on the story for 3 months published it the moment the voluntary agreement broke down. They weren't protecting Patton. They were protecting the invasion of Italy. Charles Kuhl was found by the historian Ladislas Farrago in 1963 and interviewed at length. Farrago's research notes, held at Boston University, include a transcript of that interview. Kuhl said, on tape, "I didn't hate him. I thought he was right at the time. I was scared and ashamed of being scared. Later, when I understood what was wrong with me, I felt different. But I never blamed him the way the papers did." That statement, the victim's qualified ambivalence toward the act, is more morally complex than either the institutional condemnation of Patton or the counter-narrative of the general who demanded more of his men than they thought they had. Kuhl had been damaged, diagnosed, and struck, and his recollection, 20 years later, wasn't simple. It wasn't simple because what happened to him in that ward was itself not simple. A man who believed in will encountering a man whose will had been worn through, and neither of them understanding what the other was. Chapter 12, Rommel and the Wall, Defending the Undefendable Rommel's Inspection. Report number 7, dated the 27th of February 1944, now is in the Bundesarchiv Militär Archiv in Freiburg under reference RH 1904/51. It is 61 pages long. Page 3 contains a table, typed by a staff officer, listing the number of beach obstacles, Hembalken, which are the stop beams, check hedgehogs, and element C wire obstacles, per 100 meters of beach frontage in each Army Group sector along the French coast. Rommel has annotated this table in red pencil. In the margin beside Army Group B's Normandy sector totals, he has written 3 words in German, Zehntel de Nötigen, 1/10 of what's needed. Beneath it, underlined twice, unacceptable, unacceptable. And at the bottom of the same page, in the same red pencil, a target date by which he wants full density achieved, the 1st of April, 1944. As the actual Allied landing will come on the 6th of June. If Rommel's April deadline had been met, the obstacle density on what the Americans would call Omaha Beach would have been 10 times what the Rangers encountered. The Atlantic Wall, the chain of fortifications running from Norway to the Spanish border along the European coast, was, by the beginning of 1944, simultaneously one of the most massive construction projects in history and one of the greatest propaganda exercises of the war. Goebbels' ministry had produced newsreel footage and press coverage that presented a continuous, impassable barrier of reinforced concrete and steel. The reality, which Rommel discovered when he was appointed to inspect and improve it in November of 1943. They was a series of strong points separated by long stretches of essentially undefended beach, a workforce that was chronically short of steel and concrete due to Albert Speer's prioritization of tank production over coastal fortification, and a command structure, Army Group B under Rommel, Army Group G to the south, all nominally under Commander-in-Chief West von Rundstedt, that had produced a set of competing and irreconcilable defensive philosophies that nobody at the top had resolved. The strategic argument between Rommel and von Rundstedt is the central intellectual drama of the Atlantic Wall's defense, and it deserves to be stated precisely because it's often reduced to a personality conflict. Von Rundstedt believed that the Allied landing force, once ashore, should be allowed to advance inland until it was separated from naval gunfire support, then destroyed by a centrally held panzer reserve that would be committed once the real landing site was identified, on the assumption that the Allies would attempt a diversion landing before their main effort. Rommel believed this was wrong in two specific ways. First, that Allied air superiority would destroy any armored reserve attempting to move to the coast in daylight, making central reserves functionally immobile. Second, that the decision about where to commit the reserves had to be made in the first 6 hours before the Allies could consolidate a beachhead, which meant the reserves had to be close enough to the beach to reach it in 6 hours. Rommel's memoranda on this subject, in the Bundesarchiv under R.H. 1904/53, and are among the most analytically rigorous documents he produced in his career. They were also, in their central argument, correct, and they were overruled. The organization Tod engineer Hans Zonder, identified in OT personnel records at the Bundesarchiv, was among the engineers who actually built the beach obstacles that Rommel designed and specified. The records from his unit's work on the Calvados coast, which would become the Normandy landing area, show the gap between Rommel's specifications and what the material constraints permitted in practice. Rommel had specified, based on his analysis of landing craft approaches, that obstacles should be placed at 1 per 3 meters of beach frontage, at multiple tidal levels, with teller mines attached to detonate on contact with landing craft hulls. Sander's records show actual installed density running between 1 per 8 and 1 per 15 meters, depending on the sector, with mine attachment rates below specification due to a specific technical problem. The waterproofing of the teller mine's detonating mechanisms was failing in sustained saltwater tidal conditions. The OT engineer's solution, a tar-sealed detonator housing, worked on approximately 60% of installed mines. The other 40% had flooded detonators that wouldn't fire. The command authority problem over the Panzer Reserve reached its most consequential form in April of 1944, when Hitler decided personally to retain control of 4 panzer divisions as OKW Reserve, releasable only on his direct order. This meant that in the event of an Allied landing, the armor Rommel needed to reach the beaches in 6 hours was legally and bureaucratically available only if the Führer, who was known to sleep late and to resist being woken for operational decisions, personally authorized their release. Rommel argued strenuously against this arrangement through multiple channels. His arguments are in the file. The arrangement stood, and on the 6th of June, 1944, as Allied forces landed on 5 beaches in Normandy, the OKW Panzer Reserve sat behind the Seine, waiting for an authorization that took until mid-afternoon to arrive, by which point the beachheads were consolidated enough that the window Rommel had identified, the 6-hour window, had closed. In what makes Rommel's position in the spring of 1944 so worth sustained attention is its combination of strategic clarity and operational powerlessness. He understood with considerable precision what needed to be done. He understood that it wasn't being done. He wrote the post-mortem of his own defense while building it. The inspection reports literally document a gap between requirement and reality that he knew could not be closed in time. His signal to Kesselring after Tobruk 2 years earlier, "Without Malta, everything I do hereafter is a gamble," had the same quality of clear-eyed self-assessment. Rommel was not a man who deceived himself about operational realities. He was a man who operated within operational realities he couldn't change, and did so with a tactical energy and intelligence that made the gap between the possible and the required less catastrophic than it might otherwise have been. Whether that constitutes greatness or tragedy depends on what you think history owes to commanders who are right about everything except their ability to change it. When I was reading the Bundesarchiv correspondence between Rommel and OKW during this period, the formal signals, the inspection reports, the requests for steel allocation that went unanswered, and the requests for panzer positioning authority that were denied, I kept returning to a single phrase in Rommel's personal diary from March of 1944. Ich schreibe für die Akte. I am writing for the record. He knew the memos weren't changing anything. He was filing them anyway. Because the record would survive, and the record would show that he had seen what was coming and said so. That isn't a general managing a defense. That is a general managing his posthumous evaluation. And the fact that he was doing it in March of 1944, 3 months before the landing, 5 months before the assassination attempt that would destroy him, suggests that he had already understood, at some level, how this was going to end. The beach obstacle program, despite its shortcomings, did achieve something real. At Omaha Beach, the installed obstacle density, one obstacle per approximately 12 meters of frontage, was sufficient to force most landing craft to release their troops at the outer obstacle line rather than at the water line. Meaning the men waded ashore through 200 meters of open water under fire rather than 50. The casualties at Omaha on the 6th of June were approximately 2,000 killed and wounded. Military historians have modeled what the figure would have been at Rommel's specified 3-meter obstacle density, and the estimates range from 50 to 80% higher, meaning, paradoxically, that achieving Rommel's defensive specification might have produced a disaster large enough to threaten the entire landing's viability. The obstacles that did exist cost the Allies a great deal. The ones that weren't built might have cost them everything. Rommel left his headquarters on the 5th of June for his wife Lucy's birthday in Herlingen. Ikech had been briefed by his meteorological staff that the weather conditions in the Channel were too severe for an Allied amphibious operation for at least another 48 hours. The Allied forecast, using weather station data from the North Atlantic that German meteorology couldn't access, showed a brief operational window opening on the 6th. Rommel was 500 miles away. The reserve panzers sat waiting for Hitler's authorization, which didn't come until mid-afternoon. By 6 in the evening on the 6th of June, the Allies had landed approximately 156,000 men on 5 beaches. The wall that was 1/10 of what it needed to be had been crossed, and the man who had designed it identified its deficiencies and written memos about its failure in advance was driving back from his wife's birthday party in a staff car, trying to reach a phone. Chapter 13, Third Army, The Race Across France. Third Army, G4 Fuel Report, the 28th of August, 1944. The document is in the National Archives in Washington under Record Group 407. Third Army Records, Box 3847, and it is stamped Urgent in the top right corner in red ink. The relevant line reads, Pol status as of 2,000 hours, 0 gallons of 80-octane aviation gasoline, 47,000 gallons of MIT-80 gasoline on hand. Daily consumption at current operational tempo, 400,000 gallons. Time to operational halt at current consumption without resupply, approximately 2.8 hours. 2.8 hours, not days, hours. Third Army, which had advanced 35 miles the day before, had enough fuel to run its engines for less than 3 hours. The day after this report was filed, it advanced 15 miles and began to run dry. The most spectacular American operational performance of the Second World War was about to stop, not from German resistance, not from terrain, but because the truck route from Normandy couldn't keep pace with the army it was feeding. Third Army was activated on the 1st of August, 1944, following the Cobra breakout from the Normandy hedgerow country. The strategic context was a German defensive line that had been holding for 7 weeks, suddenly collapsing along a 50-mile front, creating a gap through which Patton's newly operational army could pour like water, finding its level. What followed over the next 26 days is, by any operational metric, extraordinary. Third Army advanced simultaneously in 3 directions: east toward the Seine, south toward the Loire, and west into Brittany. It covered territory at rates that the Army's planning staffs had not built into their supply calculations, because the planning staffs had not been told to plan for rates like these. The standard planning assumption for sustained armored advance was 12 miles per day. Patton's army was averaging between 35 and 40. The supply chain was not built for this math, and it knew it. The M4 Sherman tank's fuel system is the technical constraint that frames everything else about Third Army's August campaign. The Sherman carried a total fuel capacity of 98 gallons, a 75-gallon main tank, and 2 11.5-gallon auxiliary tanks. At road speed of roughly 25 miles per hour, fuel consumption was approximately 0.7 gallons per mile. Cross-country at combat speed, closer to 15 miles per hour on soft or broken terrain, that figure rose to 1.2 gallons per mile. Third Army's roughly 700 operational Shermans, advancing cross-country at the pace the campaign required, were consuming approximately 29,400 gallons per day in tank fuel alone, before accounting for half-tracks, artillery prime movers, supply trucks, jeeps, the field kitchens, the medical vehicles, and the 300,000 other men and machines that a field army carries with it. The Red Ball Express, the one-way dedicated truck circuit that the Army established on the 25th of August to feed the advance, was delivering 12,500 tons per day at its peak operation. Third Army's full-tempo requirement was 14,000 tons. The gap never closed. The Falaise question is unavoidable in any honest account of the August campaign, and I want to address it as directly as the evidence permits rather than retreating into the diplomatic ambiguity that most accounts use to avoid offending the memory of either Patton or Bradley. On the 12th of August, Patton's 15th Corps, commanded by General Wade Hislop, was advancing north from Le Mans toward Argentan on a direct collision course with the Canadian First Army, pushing south toward Falaise. The junction of those two forces would have encircled the bulk of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, potentially 150,000 men, in what would have been the largest encirclement of German forces in the Western Theater. Bradley halted Patton at Argentan on the 13th. Between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers, the estimates vary because the counting was done in chaos, escaped through the gap between the halted American forces and the Canadians who hadn't yet arrived. There are 3 competing explanations for the Argentan halt, and they are not equally supported by the primary sources. Bradley, in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, says the halt was necessary because closing the gap required Patton's corps to advance into the Canadian Army's operational zone, at risking fratricide and confused fighting, and that logistically, his forces were overextended. Patton, in War as I Knew It, calls the halt the most costly mistake of the war in Europe, and attributes it primarily to Montgomery's influence over Eisenhower and to excessive caution in the Allied command. The military historian Carlo d'Este, who had access to both sets of operational records when writing his 1995 biography of Patton, concluded that Bradley's operational justification was sound, but that his public framing of it was post hoc rationalization, designed to distribute responsibility for a decision that was genuinely difficult. The documents support d'Este's reading. The halt was probably correct given the coordination constraints. Patton's fury about it was genuine. Both things are true. And neither cancels the other. When I was working through Colonel Oscar Koch's intelligence reports for the 12th Army Group during this period, Koch was Third Army's G2, its intelligence officer, and one of the more underappreciated figures of the campaign. I found something that rarely appears in the standard accounts. Koch had predicted the German breakout through the Falaise Gap using traffic analysis of supply roads 4 days before it began. His report, filed with 12th Army Group headquarters, identified the specific roads the Germans would use and estimated the timing of the breakout within a 12-hour window. The report was received. There is a receipt stamp on the copy in the National Archives. It received no response. The prediction was accurate. The intelligence was available. The command structure didn't act on it in time. Koch's report was rediscovered in the NARA stacks in 1991, and its existence substantially complicates the narrative that the Falaise Gap was an unforeseeable operational surprise. The Red Ball Express deserves its own paragraph, because it was one of the most demanding logistical operations in American military history, and it gets compressed into a single sentence in most campaign accounts. Operating from the 25th of August to the 16th of November, 1944, the Express used 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day on dedicated one-way circuits, trucks going east on one road, empty trucks returning west on a parallel road, all the system designed to eliminate the traffic conflicts that had been choking the supply routes since the Cobra breakout. At peak operation, it was delivering 12,500 tons per day. The drivers were exhausted. Many of the trucks were overloaded beyond their rated capacity. The roads were disintegrating under the weight. And the statistics that don't appear in the celebratory accounts of the Red Ball Express are the maintenance figures. By September of 1944, approximately 25% of the Express's truck fleet was non-operational at any given time due to mechanical failure, because the pace of operations had entirely eliminated the maintenance windows that kept the vehicles running. The Express was consuming itself to feed the Army. Third Army halted at the Meuse River on the 30th of August. Not from German resistance, but from fuel. The halt was not a tactical decision. It was a physical one. The tanks stopped because they had nothing to run on, and the trucks that would have brought them fuel were themselves running low. Patton was not accepting this quietly. His diary entries for late August and early September are among the most operationally frustrated writing in the American record of the war. A commander who could see the German frontier 60 miles away, who believed his army could reach it, who was being stopped by a logistics system that his own pace had broken. He sent increasingly urgent signals to Bradley and to Eisenhower's headquarters requesting fuel priority over Montgomery's northern axis. The signals were filed, the fuel went north. Eisenhower had decided on the broad front strategy, maintaining pressure across the entire Allied line rather than concentrating resources on a single axis. And Patton's Third Army was not the selected axis for the decisive push. What I find most analytically interesting about the halt at the Meuse isn't the operational frustration, which is well documented and understandable. It's the logistics preparation that had been happening quietly in the background since July. Patton's supply officer Walter Muller, in the weeks when Third Army was halted on the Moselle for fuel in late September and October, established pre-positioned supply depots at Thionville and Luxembourg City that no one had ordered and no one had specifically authorized. These depots held, among other things, 180,000 rations, that 14,000 tons of ammunition, and 70,000 gallons of antifreeze, stored in October, against a winter offensive that hadn't been ordered in a strategic environment where Allied intelligence was forecasting German collapse before Christmas. Muller, who had been buying fuel from Louisiana gas stations in 1941, was doing the same thing he'd always done, looking at what the Army was going to need before the Army knew it needed it, and quietly arranging it. Those antifreeze stores would determine whether the Bastogne relief was possible. But that story belongs to the next chapter. The broader operational achievement of Third Army's August campaign is worth stating plainly, because the logistical crisis and the Falaise debate can't obscure it. In 26 days of active operations, his Third Army liberated an area larger than Belgium, advanced 300 miles at rates that no previous American formation had achieved or even planned for, and destroyed or captured approximately 250,000 German soldiers at a cost of approximately 7,000 American casualties. The ratio of achievement to cost in those 26 days is without parallel in the American military experience of either World War, and the man who commanded it was simultaneously violating his superior's orders about the pace of advance, running his army on fuel it wasn't authorized to have, and producing results that made every argument about his methods moot. The method was the point. The method was also the problem. It always was, and it always would be. Chapter 14, Rommel's Last Road. July 17 to October 14. In 1944, Lucy Rommel's testimony to the post-war Spruchkammer, the German denazification court, in Stuttgart was filed in December of 1945. The document is in the Staatsarchiv Stuttgart under reference E, A99/0, 01 B U305, and it runs to 11 pages. On the fourth page, describing the morning of the 14th of October, 1944, she writes, "Two generals arrived at 12 noon. I had been told they would come. They spoke with my husband in his study for 12 minutes. I waited on the stairs. When the door opened, Erwin looked at me and said only, 'I will be dead in 15 minutes. Then he said, 'See that Manfred gets the school records from the desk.' Then he went with them. 12 minutes in the study, 15 minutes to die. A field marshal of the German army, and one of the most famous soldiers in the world, was given less time to make his final decision than it takes to eat a meal. And his last instruction to his wife was about his son's school records. That domestic detail, small, specific, utterly human, is more revealing than anything his biographers have written about his genius. The road that brought Rommel to that staircase on the 14th of October began on the 17th of July, 1944, on a secondary road designated RN158 near the Norman town of Rivalry. His staff car, a Horch 830, our open touring vehicle, was attacked at approximately 1800 hours by two Royal Air Force Spitfires operating in ground attack configuration. The driver was killed in the first pass. The car left the road at speed, and Rommel was thrown clear. At striking the road surface with sufficient force to produce 3 skull fractures, loss of the orbital bone around his left eye, and unconsciousness that lasted for hours. The RAF strafing report for that day, cross-referenced against the German field hospital admission record that documents Rommel's injuries, confirms both the time and the mechanism of injury. He was 42 days from the Normandy landing, 59 days from the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler, and 89 days from his death. He spent most of that time in medical recovery, in a country that was simultaneously losing a war and hunting its own conspirators. The relationship between Rommel and the July 20th plot is the most contested biographical question in his record, and it has been contested so vigorously and by so many parties with different interests that I want to be careful about what the documents actually establish versus what the competing narratives want them to establish. The Gestapo investigation file on the conspiracy, which eventually connected Rommel through General Karl Strolin, the mayor of Stuttgart, and a longtime associate of Rommel's, is in the Bundesarchiv under R58/4459. The file records that Strolin had told Rommel in a meeting in February of 1944 that serious military figures were considering removing Hitler by force, and that the Allies had indicated through back channels that they would offer peace terms to a German government without Hitler. As Rommel's recorded response, in testimony given under interrogation by officers who had every incentive to produce incriminating evidence, was to say that it would be good if that came to pass. That sentence is the legal basis for his prosecution, a sentence of qualified assent expressed in a private conversation reported under interrogation. David Irving's 1977 biography, Trail of the Fox, argued that this evidence was entirely insufficient to connect Rommel to the conspiracy in any meaningful way, and that his forced suicide was the judicial murder of an innocent man. Ralph Georg Reuth's Rommel, the End of a Legend, published in 2004, and based on Bundesarchiv files that were not available to Irving, showed that Rommel was more aware of specific planning than Irving acknowledged, that the conversations with Strolin were not isolated, that other senior officers had approached him with similar proposals. But Ruth also concluded that Rommel was not an active participant in the plot. Researchers at the Bibliothek für Zeitgeschichte, who examined the full Gestapo file in 2007, found the evidence insufficient for conviction under any standard of evidence that a functioning legal system would recognize. The Gestapo file establishes that Rommel knew. It doesn't establish that he acted. In a functioning state, that distinction matters. In the Third Reich of July 1944, it didn't. Next, the cyanide capsule that was brought to Herrlingen on the 14th of October was a standard Wehrmacht-issue Zyankali capsule, potassium cyanide, approximately 300 milligrams, roughly 3 times the estimated lethal dose for a man of Rommel's weight and condition. The mechanism of death is cellular hypoxia. The cyanide ion binds with ferric iron in the enzyme cytochrome C oxidase, blocking the cell's ability to process oxygen. At that dose, death occurs in 1 to 3 minutes. The fact that the two generals arrived in a car, that they brought a vehicle in which Rommel could take the capsule privately rather than conducting any formal proceeding, indicates that the cyanide had been brought specifically for this purpose, and that both sides understood how the visit would end before it began. Money 12 minutes in the study to confirm what everyone already knew. 15 minutes. The machinery of the Nazi state was precise about some things. The Nazi propaganda apparatus began manufacturing Rommel's official death narrative within hours. Goebbels' ministry issued 14 press releases across occupied Europe within 48 hours of his death, each describing Field Marshal Rommel as having died nobly of wounds sustained in the service of the fatherland in Normandy. 0 releases mentioned suicide. 0 releases mentioned the two generals or the car or the 15 minutes. The manufacturing of this narrative consumed approximately 240 man-hours of propaganda ministry resources, documented in the ministry's internal work logs. Rommel received a state funeral. Hitler sent a wreath. O. von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy, describing his colleague as having fallen with his face turned to the enemy. Von Rundstedt knew this wasn't true. He gave the eulogy anyway. The ceremony was impeccable. It was also, from first word to last, a lie. What I find most important to say here, and it's something that gets lost between the hagiography that wants Rommel to be a clean-handed knight and the revisionism that wants to implicate him in everything, is that the clean Wehrmacht myth that grew up around Rommel in the post-war decades was not primarily his doing. It was the doing of the people who needed it. B. H. Little Hart needed it to validate his theories about mechanized warfare, because a brilliant mechanized warrior, who was also a war criminal, made for a less convenient case study. The post-war West German state needed it to provide its population with Wehrmacht figures they could honor, without confronting what the Wehrmacht had actually done. The British military establishment needed it because "we were beaten by a genius" is easier to process institutionally than "we were beaten by a reasonably good general with better operational instincts in a particular terrain and period." The myth was useful. The myth was built. And Rommel, who was dead, could not object to the construction or the purposes it served. His son Manfred, who was 15 years old on the 14th of October, 1944, and who was in the house when the two generals arrived, went on to become the first social democratic mayor of Stuttgart, serving from 1974 to 1996. In a 1982 interview, during transcribed in the Stuttgart City Archive, Manfred Rommel said, "I have been asked my whole life what my father was fighting for. I think he was fighting near the end, for the men under his command. I'm not sure he knew what country he was fighting for by 1944. That assessment, careful, specific, delivered by the person who had the most direct claim to authority over it, seems to me more honest and more useful than either the hagiography or the demolition. A man fighting for the men under his command, in a country, and for a regime he had stopped believing in, producing brilliant military work in service of a catastrophically wrong cause. That's not a comfortable conclusion. It has the quality of being true. The historical argument about what Rommel knew and when he knew it will continue is because the archives are not fully resolved on the question, and because the question has political dimensions that make purely scholarly answers unstable. What the documents do establish, without serious dispute, is this. Rommel was the most operationally gifted German field commander of the North African theater. He understood the structural impossibility of his strategic situation with considerable clarity. He communicated that understanding formally and repeatedly without effect, and he was killed by the regime he served because that regime correctly identified him as a man who had stopped being its instrument. He took the cyanide in the car. The school records were in the desk. Lucy waited on the stairs. Chapter 15. The Bulge, Patton's finest hour or his most fortunate moment. Third Army Operations Journal. And the 19th of December, 1944, 10:30 in the morning. The document is in the National Archives under Record Group 407. Third Army Records, and the entry reads, General Patton departed Third Army CP for meeting at Verdun per Army Group Order. 3 contingency plans, nickel, dime, quarter, issued to Corps commanders by General Patton before departure. Nickel, attack northward, 3rd Corps. Dime, attack northward, 12th Corps. Quarter, combined. He had the plans ready before the meeting at Verdun, where Eisenhower asked him to prepare plans. That sentence needs reading twice. The famous declaration at Verdun, "I can attack in 48 hours," which produced visible skepticism from every senior officer in the room, and which has since been presented as Patton's supreme moment of operational boldness. Was not an improvisation made under pressure. The contingency planning had begun by the Operations Journal's own timestamp before he left for the meeting. Patton didn't promise what he hadn't already started. He announced what was already in motion. The German offensive in the Ardennes, which began on the 16th of December, 1944, was the Wehrmacht's last major strategic offensive on the Western Front. 25 German divisions, approximately 250,000 men, struck through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg against a thinly held American line, aiming to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies. The initial success was substantial. Within 72 hours, several American divisions had been overrun or surrounded, and the scale of the penetration had created genuine alarm at Chaef. The 101st Airborne Division, caught in its billets at Bastogne, found itself encircled in a town that happened to sit at the intersection of 7 roads that the German operational plan required in order to bring its supply columns forward. Bastogne had to be taken. The 101st, under the acting command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, declined to cooperate with this requirement. The 90-degree reorientation of Third Army, 3 Corps, approximately 133,000 men, 2,000 vehicles, 30,000 tons of supplies, all repositioned from a south-facing offensive axis to a north-facing attack axis in 72 hours, is, by any engineering standard, something that should not have been possible. The temperature during the move averaged -8 degrees Celsius. Road visibility due to fog and snow was frequently below 200 meters. Vehicle engines were freezing solid overnight without antifreeze. The antifreeze problem is where Walter Mueller appears again, quietly and critically. The 70,000 gallons of antifreeze he had pre-positioned at Thionville and Luxembourg City in October, without orders against a winter offensive that hadn't been ordered, in defiance of every planning assumption about the war ending before Christmas, was the difference between an armored force that could start its engines on the morning of December 22nd and one that couldn't. The operation's most celebrated logistics achievement was enabled by a decision made 2 months earlier that nobody had asked for. McAuliffe's communications from inside the Bastogne perimeter during the critical 72 hours before Third Army arrived are a complicating element in the standard narrative of the relief, and they deserve honest treatment. His supply reports for the 23rd through the 25th of December show the garrison with 2 days of ammunition and 3 days of food remaining when Patton's leading elements broke through on the 26th. The garrison was tight. It was not overrun. McAuliffe's own post-war assessment, given in a 1960 interview with Army historians, was, "We could have held another 48 hours, but the relief was very, very welcome." That's not the sentence of a man who was hours from collapse. It's the sentence of a man who was under serious pressure and for whom the relief came at the right time rather than the last possible moment. The distinction matters for the historical record, though it doesn't diminish the operational achievement of getting there. The actual physical breakthrough to Bastogne was accomplished by a light tank platoon of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess. Boggess didn't fight his way through a German ring on the afternoon of December 26th. He drove through a temporarily open gap in the German encirclement line, a gap created by the preceding 3 days of pressure from multiple directions, and made radio contact with the 101st Perimeter Guard at 1650 hours. His radio report, it logged in the 4th Armored's communications record, contacted forces, mission accomplished. The dramatic relief of Bastogne was, physically, a drive through an opening that the preceding 72 hours of pressure had created. The opening was there because Patton's corps had been attacking continuously, and the German encirclement line had been stretched and thinned. Boggess drove through what the Army's effort had opened. That's not a diminishment. It's an accurate description of how military operations actually work. General Hesse von Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, was interrogated by American historical officers in 1946. The transcript is in the National Archives under Record Group 549, Box 88. Manteuffel said, "We knew Patton was coming. We had the signal intelligence. We could not believe the speed. Our estimate was 4 days minimum. He arrived in 3. I still do not understand how he moved the corps in that weather. The Germans were watching. They had the intercepts. They had correctly identified the axis of the American counterattack. And they still couldn't get ahead of it." Von Manteuffel's admission is, in its way, more useful than any American account of the operation, because it describes the effect from the perspective of the force being acted upon. The effect was disbelief followed by inadequate response time. That is exactly what Patton's method was designed to produce. What the Bastogne operation also established, quietly and without much contemporary notice, was the operational ceiling of Patton's corps-level logistics management. The three-corps reorientation used every pre-positioned reserve Müller had assembled, consumed fuel at rates that left the lead elements of the relief force running on fumes in the final 20 miles, and left the follow-on forces short of ammunition for the fighting that continued after the initial link-up. The operation worked. It worked precisely. It worked with no margin remaining. Müller's after-action assessment, written in January of 1945 and filed with the Third Army records, notes that a 4th day of sustained offensive operations at the same tempo, without additional resupply, would have required halting for 36 hours. The relief of Bastogne was achieved with exactly the resources available and not 1 gallon more. That is either superb logistics management or operational luck, and probably both. And the line between them is not always clear in real-time command decisions. The broader context of the Battle of the Bulge, and this is something that gets compressed in the Bastogne narrative, is that Third Army's contribution, while operationally brilliant, was one element in an Allied response that involved multiple armies, massive air power once the weather cleared on the 23rd of December, and the simple arithmetic of German fuel and ammunition stocks that couldn't sustain the offensive past its initial momentum. The German advance had, by its 7th day, consumed a significant fraction of the fuel that OKW had stockpiled for the operation. German armored units were being abandoned by their crews when the tanks ran dry. The offensive that Schaff had briefly feared might reach Antwerp was already running out of its own internal energy before Patton's relief column reached Bastogne. The relief was decisive, and it was necessary. It did not, in the larger operational sense, save the battle. The battle was being won by arithmetic, by Allied air power, and by the same supply failure that had dogged German operations since 1941 in a different desert. The mythology of Bastogne, Patton's personal triumph, the audacious pivot, the 48 hours that saved the war, is not inaccurate. It is incomplete. The complete version includes the Operations Journal timestamp that shows the planning predated the meeting, includes Müller's October antifreeze decision, includes McAuliffe's assessment that the garrison had 2 more days, and includes Boggess driving through an opening rather than blasting through a ring, includes von Manteuffel's interrogation, confirming that the speed was real and that it worked, and includes the fuel accounting showing the operation ended with nothing in reserve. The complete version is more interesting than the mythology. It shows a genuine operational achievement, produced not by a single moment of audacious decision, but by months of preparation. One logistics officer's unjustified optimism about needing anti-freeze, and a fighting force that had been rebuilt from the men who ran at Kasserine. That arc, from Kasserine to Bastogne, from crew-abandoned non-combat loss to von Manteuffel's disbelief, is the actual story of what the American Army did between February of 1943 and December of 1944. Ulm Chapter 16, Rhine, Elbe, and the arguments that outlasted the war. Third Army Operations Journal, the 5th of April, 1945, 900 hours. General Patton signals 12th Army Group. Third Army prepared to advance Hohenberg-Pilsen-Prague axis. Estimate 3 days to Czechoslovak capital. Request permission. The request was denied at 13:42, the same day. Eisenhower's cable read, Prague has no military significance at this time. Advance halted at prearranged demarcation line. Patton's response, as recorded by his aide in the Operations Journal, was to dictate a formal acknowledgement. Message received and understood. His diary entry for the same evening reads, We have lost the peace while winning the war. Ike doesn't see it yet. He will. Both documents are in the record, in the formal message and the private conviction. He sent one and wrote the other, and never confused which was which is itself a kind of discipline that his critics tended not to give him credit for. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, on the night of the 22nd of March, 1945, is the operation that most precisely captures the Patton method in its most refined form. 18 hours before Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, a set-piece Rhine crossing that had consumed weeks of preparation, required the construction of significant engineer infrastructure, and involved the largest Allied airborne operation since Market Garden. Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim with minimal preparation, minimal fanfare, and minimal resistance. Having found a stretch of river where German defenses were thin and having moved before the defenders could reinforce it. His call to Marshall, Don't tell anyone, but I've crossed the Rhine. To hell with it. We're across, is the most Patton-shaped sentence of the European campaign. The competitiveness, the concealment, followed immediately by announcement, the absolute certainty that he'd done something worth telling, all in 12 words. The technical capability that enabled the Oppenheim crossing had been substantially improved since North Africa and Sicily. By March of 1945, a significant portion of Third Army's Sherman fleet had been upgraded to the 76mm M1A2 gun, which had been requested by Patton in writing in July of 1943, and which Army ordnance had delayed for over a year while insisting the original 75mm was adequate. The 76mm armor-piercing round, at a muzzle velocity of 792 meters per second, could penetrate 93 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor at 1,000 meters, enough to defeat a Panzer IV and marginally effective against a Panther's flanks. What it still couldn't reliably defeat was a Tiger I's frontal armor, which ran to 100 millimeters of plate at 0 degrees. But by March of 1945, the Tiger Is were running out of fuel more reliably than they were being defeated by tank gun. The armor balance had been superseded by the logistics balance, which was entirely in the Allies' favor. The Merkers salt mine discovery on the 12th of April is an episode that most Patton accounts include for color and then leave. I want to dwell on it slightly longer because it's the best single example of Patton exercising the restraint and institutional responsibility that his critics said he was constitutionally incapable of. A Third Army unit on routine sweep discovered, 2,100 feet underground in a potassium salt mine near the German town of Merkers, the following: 100 tons of gold bullion in Reichsbank bags, approximately $3 billion in various currencies, and 89 paintings evacuated from Berlin's Kaiser Friedrich Museum in 1939. Including works by Raphael, Dürer, and Rembrandt. Patton ordered the site photographed, inventoried, and sealed within hours of discovery. He filed a complete report up the chain. He did not touch anything. He did not redistribute anything. He ensured the art objects were protected and documented and handed off to the monuments and fine arts officers who were authorized to manage them. The man who bought fuel from Louisiana gas stations without authorization and violated orders about the armistice negotiations at Casablanca handled the Merkers discovery by the book, completely without deviation. He understood which rules were operationally irrelevant and which ones weren't. The Prague question, whether Patton could have and should have reached the Czechoslovak capital before the Soviets in April of 1945, is the final strategic argument of his career in Europe, and the evidence on it is clearer than the Falaise debate. Ray Stephen Ambrose in Eisenhower, Soldier and President, published in 1990, argues that Soviet forces were already within 50 miles of Berlin when Patton's leading elements were 200 miles from Prague, and that the military geography made Berlin impossible for Third Army, regardless of political decisions. He is correct about Berlin. Victor Davis Hansen, in The Soul of Battle, published in 1999, argues that Prague was militarily achievable, and that Eisenhower's decision to halt at the prearranged demarcation line was a political choice rather than a military one, made on the assumption that Soviet cooperation in the Pacific theater was more valuable than the political shape of post-war Central Europe. Hansen is correct about Prague. The two arguments are about different cities, and they're both right. And Patton was asking about Prague, not Berlin. Eisenhower was answering about a political calculation that involved more than Prague. Patton was relieved of Third Army command on the 2nd of October, 1945. The proximate cause was a press conference in which he compared the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties as a matter of political organization, suggesting that former Nazis should be used in the Bavarian occupation administration because they were simply the people with administrative experience. The quote from the official transcript, "The Nazi thing is just like a Republican-Democrat fight." The reaction was immediate and politically untenable, but Eisenhower's decision to relieve him wasn't made because of the quote. If the quote was the final instance in a pattern that went back to the Casablanca armistice negotiations in 1942, back to the slapping incident in 43, back to the Argentan halt dispute in 44, back to every moment when Patton had expressed the view, privately or publicly, that military judgment should override political authority in matters that intersected with both. Eisenhower had been managing that pattern for 3 years. The October press conference didn't start the problem. It ended his patience with it. What the spring of 1945 established about Patton, in aggregate, is something that the war's momentum had kept obscured, and that the occupation stasis suddenly made visible. He was a man entirely calibrated for war, specifically for the kind of mobile offensive war that the summer and fall of 1944 had required. The occupation required something different: patience, political sensitivity, the willingness to defer to civilian authority in ways that Patton found not just difficult, but conceptually wrong. He had spent his adult life building a theory of command that treated political constraints as obstacles to operational effectiveness. That theory had been substantially correct during the war. It was entirely wrong for the occupation, and he didn't have another theory, he had only the one. Third Army's final accounting, from Rhine crossing to VE Day, covered 800 miles and liberated or occupied 82,000 square miles of European territory. The Army had suffered 160,692 battle casualties since activation in July of 1944. It had killed, wounded, or captured an estimated 1.4 million German soldiers. The ratio works out to approximately 1 American casualty per 9 German, a figure that no other Allied army in the European theater matched across the same period. That ratio is the final empirical statement about what Third Army's operational method produced. It didn't produce it cheaply. Nothing in that war was cheap. But the arithmetic, when you do it honestly and without sentimentality, says what it says. Chapter 17. Who was the better commander? The verdict and its limits. There is a quote that appears in more than 200 books about the Second World War. It is attributed to Patton on learning of Rommel's death in October of 1944. The quote is, "That poor, magnificent bastard. I cannot find it in the primary sources. It appears first in Ladislas Farrago's 1963 biography, Patton Ordeal and Triumph, attributed to an unnamed staff officer who allegedly overheard it. Farrago's footnotes are notoriously unreliable. The quote is almost certainly invented, or at minimum unverified, and yet it has been reprinted, modified, requoted, and cited as though it were a documented historical fact for 60 years. I want to start the final chapter of this series with a fabricated quote, not to use it, but to ask what it means that we need it to exist. Why do we need Patton to have mourned Rommel? What does the persistence of that almost certainly false story tell us about what we want from these two men that the actual historical record can't quite provide? What the record can provide, before the mythology, is the operational comparison at its most basic level. Patton commanded Third Army for 281 days of active operations. He killed, wounded, or captured approximately 1 million German soldiers, liberated approximately 250,000 square miles of territory, and did it at a personnel loss ratio of approximately 1-9 in his favor, a ratio unmatched by any comparable Allied formation. Rommel commanded Afrika Korps and Panzer Armee Africa for approximately 500 days. At his peak, he commanded roughly 150,000 German and Italian troops, and he inflicted approximately 250,000 Allied casualties, achieved a maximum advance of roughly 900 miles, and ultimately surrendered a theater, through no fault entirely his own, when his supply chain was strangled. The numbers frame the comparison. They don't resolve it. The difficulty with any direct comparison is that the two men never operated under equivalent conditions against equivalent opponents, and the professional historians who have spent careers on this question have reached conclusions that reflect their methodology as much as their evidence. D'Este's A Genius for War, which makes the most sustained case for Patton's superiority, now argues that the diversity and scale of Patton's operational record, from amphibious assault in Morocco to armored exploitation in France to corps reinvention in Tunisia to the Ardennes response, represents a broader and more demanding range of command challenges than Rommel ever faced at equivalent resource levels. Cornelius Ryan and Basil Little Hart, in their different ways, made the counter-argument that commanding against an opponent with ultra-intelligence, overwhelming material superiority, and complete air dominance is categorically easier than commanding against a well-supplied and numerically superior opponent, while working from a supply chain that was broken before you arrived. Both arguments are logically coherent. They're measuring different things. When I was working through the evidence for all 16 preceding chapters, I kept returning to a question that the operational comparison doesn't answer. What was each man's relationship with the institution that produced him? Because that relationship shapes the limits of what the operational record can tell you. Rommel's relationship with the Wehrmacht was always complicated by the political origin of his Panzer command. The OKH generals, who had questioned his appointment in 1940, never entirely stopped questioning his judgment. His supply requests were answered with silence. His tactical innovation was documented and circulated, but his strategic arguments were ignored. His most important operational advice, on Panzer Reserve positioning before D-Day, was structurally correct and completely overruled. But the Wehrmacht was capable of producing Rommel. It was not institutionally capable of fully using him. It kept making the same supply chain mistake, regardless of how many times he documented it. Patton's relationship with the American Army was equally complicated and resolved differently. He was nearly blocked from promotion in 1938. He was given a corps after Kasserine only because the preceding corps commander had been a monument to fear. He was sidelined after the slapping incident for 4 months while the army managed the political fallout. He was constrained at Argentan, halted at the Meuse, denied Prague, and he was relieved in October of 1945 for saying in public what he had been writing in his diary for years. The American Army never stopped finding Patton difficult. But, and this is the critical institutional difference, it kept him. It managed him, tolerated him, constrained him, rehabilitated him, and directed him at the problems it needed him to solve. The Wehrmacht generated Rommel and then gave him cyanide. The American Army generated Patton and then fired him. The different outcomes of those two institutional decisions are worth sitting with. The specific technical comparison of their command methods reveals something that the narrative accounts often blur. Rommel's operational method was, at its core, a system of personal command, fast, direct, forward, dependent on his physical presence at the decisive point to generate the tempo advantage that was his signature. That method was extraordinarily effective in the Cyrenaican Desert in 1941 and in the Gazala battles in 42. It became progressively less effective as the scale of operations increased beyond what one man could personally observe, as the communications technology available to both sides became more sophisticated, and as the opponents Rommel faced became less psychologically susceptible to the tempo disruption that his method required. By Normandy, he was commanding an army group, hundreds of thousands of soldiers across hundreds of miles of coast, with a command method designed for a division in the Libyan desert. The method didn't scale. Patton's method was, at its core, a system for empowering subordinates within a commander's intent, what the Army would later call mission command, though Patton's version of it was idiosyncratic and personality-dependent in ways that the doctrine tries to eliminate. But he trained his staff to anticipate requirements. He kept Mueller close for 20 years because Mueller understood what logistics looked like when it had to work faster than doctrine said was possible. He invested in pre-positioned reserves. He built contingency plans before they were asked for. He was a better delegator than his public image suggested, partly because his public image was built on his visible personal presence, the pistols, the uniform, the speech to the troops, which obscured the institutional machinery he had assembled behind it. The Bastogne operation wasn't Patton's decision. It was Patton's decision architecture, built over 3 years and staffed by people who knew how to execute it at speed. Here is where I land, after 16 chapters of evidence and 16 chapters of arguing with the evidence. That Rommel was a tactician of the very first order. In the top 5 of any war, probably top 3 of this one, certainly in the top 2 of the theater he fought in. His operational instincts in the open desert in 1941 and 42 were gifts that no institutional training produced and that no institutional framework fully captured. Against a psychologically vulnerable opponent, with a slow decision cycle and a compromised supply situation, he was very close to undefeatable. He was also, by extension, highly dependent on those specific conditions obtaining. When the opponent wasn't psychologically vulnerable, the Australians at Tobruk, Auchinleck, at El Alamein, ultimately the entire Allied logistics system that was strangling him, the brilliance found its ceiling. Patton was a better system builder, a better coalition operator, a better manager of resources at army scale. He understood in a way Rommel apparently didn't, that modern warfare at army group level is not primarily a test of personal operational genius, but of institutional capacity, the ability to build, supply, and direct a machine that is larger than any one person's vision. He built that machine, and the machine worked, and it worked because it had been thought about carefully by people other than Patton, whose names don't appear in the mythology. The comparison ultimately resolves into a choice between the question you're asking. If you want to know who should command a division in the open desert against a demoralized opponent with a broken supply chain, the answer is Rommel, and it isn't close. If you want to know who should command an army across a continent against a determined opponent in a coalition war with a functioning logistics system and a Congress watching, the answer is Patton, and it also isn't close. The tragedy of the comparison, the reason we keep having it, is that neither man was ever really given the job that suited him perfectly. Rommel was asked to hold a theater he couldn't supply. Patton was asked to operate within a coalition he found structurally maddening. Both of them did extraordinary things with the imperfect situations they were given. That's not a comfortable conclusion. History rarely is. The fabricated quote, "that poor, magnificent bastard," persists because it says something we want to be true about both men, that they were worthy of each other. That the war contained within it a personal duel between two figures of equivalent stature, and that even in death they recognized each other across the wreckage. The historical record doesn't give us that. It gives us two men who met at a fencing tournament in 1913, read some of the same books, fought in entirely different theaters against entirely different opponents, and never faced each other in battle. The quote is an invention because the duel never happened. The duel never happened because the war was larger and more chaotic and more impersonal than the mythology requires it to be. What the war actually gave us was two men operating at their respective limits in service of incompatible causes, each doing things the other couldn't have done, each failing in ways the other might not have. That's enough. It's more than enough. It doesn't need the quote.